বলে মেটা থিয়েট্রিক্যাল আমরা কাকে বলি?
নাটকের মধ্যে নাটক, আবার ড্রামার মধ্যে আবার
ড্রামার মধ্যে বলো বলো
প্লের মধ্যে আবার প্লে, মানে প্লে উইদিন প্লে।
না সেটা তো একটা দিক গেল, অ্যাবসলিউটলি রাইট। কিন্তু আমরা should we call a particular text, a particular theatrical text meta theatrical only if there is a very specific portion which can be considered to be a play within a play? আমরা মানে what is the definition in a way? আমরা মেটা থিয়েট্রিক্যাল বলতে কি বুঝি, এবং এই মেটা কথাটা আমরা in this case we were talking about meta theatricality, we can talk about meta textuality. তোমরা এখন হয় জেনেছো না হয় জানবে, there is this particular term called metafiction.
হ্যাঁ তো ইয়ে পড়িয়েছেন
অমৃতা পড়িয়েছেন, আমি এটাই বলতে টম জোন্স যেহেতু পড়িয়েছে মেটাফিকশনের কথা এসে থাকবে। later on Linda Hutcheon would come up with the term historical metafiction. So what is it? What is metafiction? What is meta theater? So it's not only about play within a play, it's about when theater comments on itself. Theater commenting on what? Theater commenting on its own theatricality, its own constructiveness. এটা আমরা বলেছি, আমি জাস্ট একটা ইয়ের মধ্যে বিবৃতির মধ্যে আনার চেষ্টা করছি। দ্য ফ্যাক্ট দ্যাট এটা ডিসকাশন হয়েছে ক্লাসে, মনে করে দেখো, টু রিং সার্টেন বেলস, দ্যাট we have, after the advent of literary realism, there is an expectation of reality from theatre, in the sense theatre, literature claiming that it is a reflection of reality. এবং we expect theatre, art, novels, anything to convince us, try and convey. It uses different kinds of techniques to convince us that what is being shown, it is not a story, it is not something imagined, fictitious, it is real, it is an exact replication, it is an exact reflection of reality. এবং ফলে সে কখনোই নিজেকে ভাই আমি গল্প বলছি বলে না, আমি তোমাকে দিস ইজ রিয়ালিটি, বাস্তব দেখাচ্ছি। আমরা যখন রিয়ালিস্টিক সিনেমা হয় আমরা কি এক্সপেক্ট করি যে তাতে একেবারে সেরকম ডিরেক্টরে সেটা করে থাকেন, তাই না? এবার এক্স্যাক্ট থিঙ্ক অ্যাবাউট নিউ রিয়ালিজম, নিউ রিয়ালিস্ট, ইটালিয়ান নিউ রিয়ালিজম, মানে ভিক্টোরিয়া লিসিকা, সেখান থেকে সত্যজিৎ রায়েরই ধরো না, একেবারে স্পেসিফিক একটা যদি ইন স্পেসিফিক হিস্টোরিক্যাল টাইম, তাহলে একেবারে এক্স্যাক্টলি সেই সময়কার তাদের ভাব ভঙ্গি আচার আচরণ, হ্যাঁ, দ্য কাইন্ড অফ ড্রেস থেকে আরম্ভ করে সেই সব কিছু মিলিয়ে সিনেমায় একটা নোশন আছে মিজোসিন, ইটস আ ফ্রেঞ্চ টার্ম, মিজোসিন, মানে দ্যাটস আ সেটিং, ইট শুড বি আ ডাইরেক্ট রিফ্লেকশন অফ রিয়ালিটি। কিন্তু বাই অ্যান্ড লার্জ ইন আমাদের এলিজাবেথান থিয়েটার we see that, আমি আগে বলেছি, that instead of that a lot of the plays they talk about theatre, they are commentary on theatre itself. There are lots of references, there are certain textures and techniques যেখানে কিন্তু থিয়েটার নিজেকে থিয়েটার কোনো দায় নেই একবারের জন্য তোমাকে কনভিন্স করানো যে ভাই তুমি যেটা দেখছো সেটা রিয়েল, সে বলছে তুমি যেটা দেখছো সেটা থিয়েটার। তাহলে in a way Tempest that is one of the most meta theatrical, in various of Shakespeare's plays, various other Elizabethan plays আমরা দেখি elements of meta theatricality. It is in a way one of the most meta theatrical of Shakespearean texts, Shakespearean plays, যেখানে তোমরা, এবার আমি তোমাদের জিজ্ঞেস করছি, এই ইফ দিস ইজ দ্য ওয়ার্কিং ডেফিনিশন অফ মেটা থিয়েট্রিক্যালিটি, তোমরা পড়েছো টেক্সটটা হোপফুলি, গিভ মি জাস্ট ইনস্টেন্সেস, কোন ঘটনা, কোন লাইন, কোন জিনিস তোমাদের মনে হয়, আমি যদি বলি গিভ মি এক্সাম্পলস, বাকি ছেড়ে দাও, গিভ মি এক্সাম্পলস অফ meta-theatrical elements in, huh? Okay, obvious, very good, the mask scene, fair enough, which very clearly is what she said, a play within a play. Art.
The speech of Prospero at the last release.
The epilogue, exactly. Prospero's final speech, the epilogue. What else? What else you think?
The entire consequences মানে যেটা পুরো টেম্পেস্টটা রেজ করাটাই তো একটা
Exactly. So the entire play, the Tempest itself, taito, it is conjured up by Prospero. It is something, the Tempest itself, it is both the central event, it is the central metaphor, it is also the frame. The subject and the frame is the same. মানে আমরা টেম্পেস্ট নিয়ে গোটা গল্পটা একটা ঝড় নিয়ে একটা টেম্পেস্ট নিয়ে, তাই তো? আবার এই টেম্পেস্ট জিনিসটাই তৈরি করা, ইট ইজ নট এ ন্যাচারাল টেম্পেস্ট। হ্যাঁ, তাহলে এই যে আমরা বারবার যে দিস, এবং আমরা অনেক সময় এলিজাবেথান থিয়েটার, we can see Elizabethan theatre in a way as sort of an extension not only of the New World politics but this very idea of the New World which can be conjured up in the theatrical space. এটা নিয়েও কথা হয়েছে আগে বারবার যে the theatre becomes sort of a link between the old world and the new during the Renaissance. Because একদিকে কি হচ্ছে থিয়েটারে, the classical forms, they are reinvented, নিয়ে আসা হচ্ছে, ট্র্যাজেডি বলো, কমেডি বলো, বারবার they are looking for links with the classical, Europe's classical past, তাই না? সেখান থেকে আনা হচ্ছে, old world texts are being translated, old world notions are sort of again used in theatre. তাহলে একদিকে so it comes from there. আমরা বারবার এইটা পড়তে গিয়ে ভার্জিলের কথা পড়ছি, ওভিডের কথা পড়ছি, but on the other hand it is being done in a time, at a time when Europe is acutely conscious of a certain newness about itself and about the rest of the world. Newness in two ways. Number one, the actual geographical discoveries, and the world as if এখানে I think Act 1 Scene 2 যখন মানে মিরান্ডার ফেমাস ফ্রেজ দ্য ব্রেভ নিউ ওয়ার্ল্ড, যেটা আমরা জানি পরবর্তীকালে অল্ডাস হাক্সলের equally famous, the title of the equally famous book. তাহলে on the one hand an entirely new, in the sense undiscovered, unknown world being sort of gradually opening up, and on the other hand new forms of knowledge, new science, new philosophy. This newness is embedded in Renaissance humanism. তাহলে এই যে newness, how do you accommodate it? The theatre becomes, the world, Elizabethan theatre treating the world as a stage, যেটা ম্যাকবেথ বলছে, the world is a stage, but it also treats the stage as an alternative world. যে এই গোটা, and in a true sense sort of a world theatre, theatre of the world. World theatre কথাটা আমি ভুল বললাম, theatre of the world. আমি কন্টেন্টের দিকে পরে আসছি, বাট এটা খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং ব্যাপার। জন গিলিস এইটা এক্সটেন্সিভলি লিখেছেন, দ্যাট হাউ this is also 1590s onwards the art of, আমরা আলোচনা করেছি, art of cartography, map making, and how the way the world is projected onto the map, there are certain parallels with the way the world is projected on the stage. the stage itself becomes an unfolding map. মানে ধরো a play like Marlowe's Tamburlaine or Shakespeare's Henry V. Tamburlaine দেখবে একটা entire sort of এই যে মিডল ইস্টে একটা পুরো একটা spatial imagination being transformed on the stage. পুরো ট্যাম্বারলিনের মানে ইন আ ওয়ে মানে মার্লো নিজের আর্মচেয়ারে বসে হি ইম্যাজিনস দিস এন্টায়ারলি নিউ ওয়ার্ল্ড অন দ্য স্টেজ, এবং ওই এক্সপ্যান্সটা ট্যাম্বারলিন ট্রাইজ টু ক্যাপচার দ্যাট এন্টায়ার এক্সপ্যান্স অফ দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড অন দ্য স্টেজ। আর টেম্পেস্টের ক্ষেত্রেও সেটাই, অ্যাজ এভরিওয়ান কারেক্টলি পয়েন্টেড আউট, the way ওই যে বললাম Tempest is also sort of in a way the last play Shakespeare. After this he sort of retires, so in a way the Tempest is his swan song. Okay, and there are constant, this is happening at a time, on the one hand as I said, this new world unfolding, on the other hand theatre itself was undergoing certain changes. Theatre had to resist from the late 1500s onwards. Theatre had to withstand a lot of ideological sort of resistance against it. Theatre ke bibhinno bhabe malign kora hocche, Puritanism is on the rise, so this theatricality of theatre is being constantly criticized. So theatre in a way, and as Shakespeare tries to do it, theatre in a way is also responding to those discourses. এবং আমরা নিউ হিস্টোরিসিজমের কথা পড়তে গিয়ে বলছি, নিউ হিস্টোরিসিস্ট they talk about it, how theatre, the Stuart dynasty at that point of time, James the First, আগে এলিজাবেথের সময় বলা, we're talking about Stuart dynasty, they were acutely aware of the power of theatre. Theatre as a means of propaganda, state propaganda, and theatre could do that, but theatre could also have seeds of resistance to the duto, propagation, subversion. Theatre could accommodate both. So the new map, I mean a particular there's this particular quotation is actually from this is this particular text published in 1559, Cosmographical Glass by Cunningham. Cosmographical Glass. তাহলে theatre being আমরা আরো বলতে গেলে theatre being sort of just like a cartography, just like a map, theatre also being compared, the stage compared with a glass, mirroring. But is it mirroring? It includes the idea of reflection, যা হচ্ছে সরাসরি দেখানো হচ্ছে, but mirroring also includes distortions. Mirroring also includes certain shifts. Mirroring is not an exact replication of reality, কিন্তু the idea of the globe and how it is reflected, a globe like Shakespeare's globe, সেইখানে তো যাই হোক কানিংহ্যাম বলছেন, now I perceive by the making and describing of this only map, I may in like sort at my pleasure draw a card for Spain, France, Germany, Italy, Greece and any particular regio, in a warm and pleasant house, without any peril of the raging seas, danger of enemies, loss of time, spending of substances, wearings of body or anguish of mind. Oh, how precious a jewel is this! It may rightly be called a cosmographical glass, in which we may behold the diversities of countries, natures and people, and innumerable forms of beasts and fowls and fishes, trees, fruits, streams and metals. তাহলে he's talking about the map. He's saying that look, what can map do? Maps give you representation. 2-dimensional representation of the 3-dimensional world, তাই তো? এবং সেখানে বলছে উইদাউট দ্য পেরিলস অফ দ্য সি, কোনো ঝুট ঝামেলা ছাড়াই আমরা একটা ভিজুয়াল ইমপ্রেশন পাচ্ছি অফ দ্য ভ্যারাইটিস অফ দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড। থিয়েটার কুড ডু এক্স্যাক্টলি দ্য সেম থিং। এখানে a tempest without the fears of the sea, without actually engaging in the physical dangers of seafaring, the excitement of seafaring and the toil and turbulence and the atmospheric disturbance, everything can be recreated. So just like a map, the theater can recreate. Representation becomes very, very important. এবং এই রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন যখনই আসছে এলিজাবেথেন থিয়েটারে, কিন্তু রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন ডাজ নট নেসেসারিলি মিন মিয়ার রেপ্লিকেশন। কারণ তো ওই যে বললাম, থিয়েটার ইজ নট ওনলি সর্ট অফ এন্টারটেনমেন্ট, it is a very, very, very potent ideological tool, and theater was acutely conscious of its own sort of ideological importance. আমি কি করতে পারি কি না পারি, আমি কত কিছু দেখাতে পারি। এবং থিয়েটার ইজ ইটসেলফ গোয়িং থ্রু সার্টেন চেঞ্জেস। আমি আগেও তোমাদের বলেছিলাম যে এই যে টেম্পেস্ট যখন হচ্ছে, ফ্রম গ্লোব শেক্সপিয়ার শিফটস টু ব্ল্যাক ফ্রায়ার্স, হুইচ ইজ আ ক্লোজ রোড, তাহলে ক্লোজার টু আওয়ার আইডিয়া অফ প্রোসেনিয়াম থিয়েটার। এর আগে কি ছিল থিয়েটার, তার আগে অবধি কি ছিল ওপেন স্টেজ, এবং এক্স্যাক্টলি দ্য স্টেজ উড ইট ওয়ে রেপ্লিকেট দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড। একটা ওপেন স্টেজ, গোল, সারাউন্ডেড বাই দ্য ভিউয়ার্স, চারিদিক থেকে তুমি দেখছো, তাই তো? এবং ইট ইউজ টু বি ওপেন টু দ্য এলিমেন্টস। ফলে আমরা শেক্সপিয়ারের যে পোয়েট্রি নিয়ে we are so enamored, we have to remember that he had to convey a lot through his language. তাই না? রাত হচ্ছে, দিন হচ্ছে, কারণ there was no artificial light earlier. তুমি যে ধরনের লাইট এফেক্ট, যে ধরনের সাউন্ড এফেক্ট, which is part of our theatrical experience now, Shakespeare didn't have it at that point of time. তাহলে হয়তো ম্যাকবেথের নাটক, ম্যাকবেথ প্লে হচ্ছে ফ্যাটফ্যাটে আলোর মধ্যে দুপুরবেলা। সো দ্যাট আ প্লে হুইচ ইজ টিঞ্জড ইন ডার্কনেস, গোটাটাই প্রায় গোটা নাটক রাতের বেলা হচ্ছে, ইজ টু কনভে থ্রু হিজ ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ। কিন্তু বাই দ্য টাইম উই এন্টার দ্য 17th century, and this is sort of the first decade of the 17th century, theatrical technology has undergone a lot of change, and theater can actually represent এই ন্যাচারাল ওয়ার্ল্ডকে নতুনভাবে রিপ্রেজেন্ট করার ক্ষমতা থিয়েটারের মধ্যে চলে এসেছে টু আ লার্জ এক্সটেন্ট। এবং এখানে আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি দিস এন্টায়ার যে প্রোসেনিয়াম স্টেজ, প্রোসেনিয়াম স্টেজের ধারণা আসছে একটা সর্ট অফ রেস্ট্রিক্টেড স্পেস। এবং প্রোসেনিয়াম স্টেজে আর কি হচ্ছে, ইয়োর ফিল্ড অফ ভিশন, যেটা আমি আগেও বলেছি, ইয়োর ফিল্ড অফ ভিশন ইজ conditioned and restricted. ধরো আগে যখন হতো ওপেন স্টেজ, গোল স্টেজ, সবাই চারিদিকে বসেছে, কেউ সামনের দিক থেকে দেখতে পাচ্ছে, কেউ পেছন দিক থেকে দেখতে পাচ্ছে, কেউ সাইডের দিক থেকে দেখতে পাচ্ছে। কিন্তু প্রসেনিয়াম স্টেজে কি তোমার পেছন একটা দিক আটকে দেওয়া হলো। সো তুমি শুধুই your field of vision সবার, ইটস আ হোমোজেনাস ফিল্ড অফ ভিশন সামনের দিকে। এবং যেটাকে আমি আগেও বলেছি, পোস্ট রেনেসা, আমি যে রেনেসা পেন্টিংয়ের দিকে দেখি, পার্সপেক্টিভ পেন্টিং, পার্সপেক্টিভ কার পার্সপেক্টিভ, এবং যেটা হুইচ বিকাম সর্ট অফ দ্য হলমার্ক অফ রেনেসা পেন্টিং। পরবর্তীকালে সেখান থেকে রিয়ালিস্টিক পেন্টিংও যেভাবে তৈরি হচ্ছে, পার্সপেক্টিভ অফ দ্য ওয়ান হুজ ডুইং ইট। Your entire field of vision is conditioned by the perspective of the maker, the painter. তাই না? তাহলে তুমি এই 180 ডিগ্রি তুমি সামনে থেকে দেখছো, তোমার এই ফিল্ড অফ ভিশনে, দ্যাট ইজ দ্য লিমিট অফ ইয়োর রিয়ালিটি। থিয়েটার ইজ রিপ্রোডিউসিং দ্যাট পার্সপেক্টিভ ইন দ্য সেম ওয়ে। তাহলে ঠিক যেমনভাবে নিউ ম্যাপস, কার্টোগ্রাফি একটা 3-dimensional রিয়ালিটিকে 2-dimensional রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন দিচ্ছে। থিয়েটার ইজ গিভিং 3-dimensional representation, কিন্তু it is sort of culling out, it is sort of conditioning your perspective in a certain manner, which gives theatre, এবং এই সময়কার theatre is immensely confident that it's actually telling you, at least in the Tempest, that yes, your entire perspective is conditioned by the stage. It's not, it's a symbiotic relation. The stage reflecting the world, the stage representing the world, but once that world is represented on the stage, it is given back to the viewer. So the theatre takes material, world কে নিয়ে রিক্রিয়েট করে আবার ফেরত দিচ্ছে। ফেরত যখন দিচ্ছে, it is conditioned by the theatrical principles, by the theatrical logic, by the ideological moorings of the theatrical form. So it is not an unmediated replication, and theatre is making absolutely clear. এই টেম্পেস্টে ওইটাই হচ্ছে দ্য মিডিয়েশন। আমি তোমাদের ডিসকাস করতে গিয়েও বলেছিলাম যে টু ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট পার্সোনালিটিস অফ দ্য টাইম, একজনের কথা বারবার বলেছিলাম, ইনিগো জোন্স, দ্য থিয়েটার ম্যানেজার কাম আর্কিটেক্ট আর্টিস্ট। এবং এই সময় এই যে ইনিগো জোন্সের নাম বারবার আসছে, আস্তে আস্তে দেখো থিয়েটারে নাও দিস, আগে কি থিয়েটার নেম বাই would only be named after the patron, the King's Company or whatever. হ্যাঁ, এবং তুমি ম্যাক্সিমাম প্রডিউসারের নাম জানলে, অ্যাক্টরদের নাম জানলে। এই যে এখন গ্র্যাজুয়ালি দ্য টেকনিশিয়ানস, ইন আ ওয়ে ইনিগো জোন্স ওয়াজ এ টেকনিশিয়ান, কিন্তু এখন সে খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট হয়ে উঠছে। ইফ ইউ লুক অ্যাট, আগেও বলছিলাম যে বেন জনসনের মাস্ক যদি দেখো, বেন জনসন এন্ড ইনিগো জোন্স ইউজ টু রেগুলারলি কোলাবোরেট, এবং এই টেকনিক্যালিটিগুলো এখন এই যে রিক্রিয়েশন, রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন অফ থিয়েট্রিক্যাল রিয়ালিটি, বাইরের রিয়ালিটিকে, ন্যাচারাল ওয়ার্ল্ডের রিয়ালিটিকে থ্রু টেকনোলজিক্যাল ইন্টারভেনশন ইট ইজ রিক্রিয়েটেড ইন্টু থিয়েট্রিক্যাল রিয়ালিটি। সো the technical aspect becomes gradually very important. এবং আমি আগে বলেছিলাম that Prospero's characterization, somewhere you have the image of Inigo Jones, the sort of, on the one hand, that he is both the auteur of this play, he conjures up the entire thing in his mind, but only conjuring up in the mind is not good enough. Then he sort of reproduces it on the stage. তাহলে the island in the same way that, এবং অনেকেই বলে থাকেন in a way Prospero, তোমাদের আমি যদি সিনেমাটা দেখাতে পারতাম ভালো হতো, আনফর্চুনেটলি আই কুডন্ট গেট হোল্ড অফ। আর এখন তোমাদের এই আমি আগে যখন সেই টরেন্ট ছিল, তোমরা জানি না, তোমরা হাউ ডু ইউ ডাউনলোড ফিল্মস নাও? ডু ইউ টেলিগ্রামে করো? টরেন্টে হয় এখন? আমি তো টরেন্টে পাচ্ছি না। আফটার দিস ওটিপি দে সো হেভি ক্র্যাকড আউট, টরেন্টের থেকে আমি আর করতে পারছি না, এককালে পারতাম। এনিওয়ে, তাহলে দেখবে প্রসপেরোস বুক, তাহলে এই টেম্পেস্টটাকেই দেখা হচ্ছে প্রসপেরোর লেখা বই, যেটা নিয়ে আমরা অথর গডের কথা হয়েছে, অ্যান্ড প্রসপেরো অ্যাজ এ রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভ অফ শেক্সপিয়ার। সো ইন দ্য সেম ওয়ে দ্যাট this is, the island is Prospero's world, created, conjured up by Prospero. In the same way, a new world is created on the stage by Shakespeare. So the island in a way is a stage where this play, this revenge play, as well as যেটা আমরা কথা বলেছি, combination of revenge and romance, যা এলিমেন্ট তখনকার দিনের থিয়েটারে হতো সেই সবকটা মিলিয়ে this play is being set on that stage of the island. And the island in that sense is a representative of the new world, both in the sense of this newly discovered world, the brave new world, but also in the sense of an alternative world which can be created and which is contained only there, only on that island. ঠিক যেমনভাবে নাটক ভেঙে যাবার পরে all the participants, the actors as well as the audience, they enjoy the play for 1 hour or 2 hours or whatever, and then they leave. In the same manner, all the participants gradually leave this island. So when you, in this particular play, when you come out of the theatre, you are not the only ones coming out of the theatre. The characters too come out of that theatrical space, of the stage, that island, and they sort of, the theatre, the theatrical stage, in the same way আমরা আগে বলেছি, this island is a microcosm of the social reality outside. The island is cut off. The island, it's very clear that this island is an alternative space outside of that social world, and yet this island replicates the social relations and social hierarchy of the outside world. It's a nebulous, complicated relation. একদিকে বলছে আমি আলাদা, কিন্তু it is a microcosm, but the representation is different. Social world কে, তার hierarchy গুলোকে নতুন করে অন্য অ্যারেঞ্জমেন্টে এখানে দেখানো হচ্ছে। কেন কিভাবে হচ্ছে এটা আমরা ডিসকাস করেছি। Prospero as both the author god as well as the new age theatre manager and technician, এবং this constant role play, performativity, meta theatricalityর সঙ্গে performativity is a very important part of this play. Prospero বারবার দেখবে he changes, এমন না আমরা তো জানি Prospero করছে সব, but the fact that he is playing different roles. So দেখবে বারবার ও কখনো গিয়ে when he plays the role of a magus, এই ম্যাগাসের কথা আমরা করি, he wears his robe, তারপর যাচ্ছে আবার অন্য রোগ করে আসছে। সো হ্যাঁ বলো একদম। তাহলে এই যে মানে এই যে রবিং অ্যান্ড ডিসরোবিং, এই যে একটা পারফরমেন্স, এই একটাই লোক, এটা ঠিক যেমনভাবে প্রসপেরো আমাদের বলে দিচ্ছে যে ভাই আমি আলাদা আলাদা রোল প্লে করছি, ঠিক তেমনিভাবে শেক্সপিয়ার ইজ অলসো, ইটস থিয়েটার commenting on itself. Theatre বলে দিচ্ছে যে দেখো ভাই I can do that in the same way that Prospero can do this. I also can do this. I can give you different perspectives of reality. I can give you all that you want. The entire world I can give you in a microcosmic form right here. Okay. তাহলে এবং এই যে এপিলগটা আমরা ওর ভেতরেই, এটা তো আমরা করেই ছিলাম, কিন্তু এপিলগ, নাও মাই চার্মস আর অল ওভারথ্রোন। তাহলে অ্যাট দ্য এন্ড থিয়েটার when it's commenting on, আমরা এপিলগটা কি, it is also a comment on its its materiality, its sort of limitedness of space, its limit, theater marking out its own limits. এই যে বলছেন যে this is the end, now my charms are all overthrown. Charm both in the sense of magic, but charm also this entire panorama that was created, the charm not only of Prospero's charm but the charm of theater. It's over. And what strength I have mine own, which is most faint. Now, 'tis true I must be here confined by you, or sent to Naples. Let me know, I must be here confined by you. So Prospero is talking to the others that you choose. আমি এখানে confined to this island, or I might go back to Naples. কারণ কি obviously I have done certain things, so it is up to you, the other people of the play. Let me note, since I have my dukedom got and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell. but release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails. Again, theatre as a project. Theatre as a project of representation. Achha. So, with the help of your good hands, gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails. And what was the project? Which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free. So this is Prospero not only addressing within the space of the play, Prospero addressing the rest of the characters. That I have got my dukedom back. I have also been able to be released from my own rage. I have been able to pardon my deceivers. But now this is up to you. You can, leave me here confined to this island, or you can take me with you. But remember, my project would fail unless I have been able to please you. Prospero, it is not only Prospero talking within the frame of the play. Prospero is also breaking the frame. And he is directly addressing his spectators. And through Prospero, Shakespeare is addressing his audience. And the kind of a symbiotic relation between the world inside the play and the world outside the play. A certain symbiosis is established. So there is a reciprocity. It is not one way. So my project fails. What was the project? To please you, the people. It's a breaking of the frame. This is something in sort of Shakespearean theatre, Elizabethan theatre. It influenced later on, much later, early 20th century, it influenced Brecht a lot. We are not certain whether Prospero is in the character, whether it is the character Prospero speaking within the play, or it is the actor who has stepped out of the character and directly addressing the spectators. And this is where the frame turn, exactly, breaking of the fourth wall. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair. So, on a self-referentiality, fat end of Shakespeare's own career, but also, as I said, theatre itself, Elizabethan theatre itself is going through a certain difficult period. There is a lot of political pushback at the theatre, rise of Puritanism, and he's writing at a rather, gradual destabilization of the state. যেটা ultimately এটা লিখছেন 1610 শেক্সপিয়ার দেখবেন না, কিন্তু within sort of 30 years theatres will close down. So the ending, this is about, Shakespeare reaching the end of his life. This is about, this particular play reaching its end. This is about Prospero reaching the end of his project. This is about, Elizabethan Jacobean theatre looking at sort of a, grim end. And all these despairs, all these anxieties sort of mix with one another. It's difficult to differentiate. eye be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. So that's what theatre does. Theatre frees us of our faults. What does he mean? He's talking about, in a way, the typical cathartic effect of theatre, that it releases the force, the theatrical force, the force that it releases. It is sort of cathartic, it is purifying, but it is also, age of the force is released, it is also, it can be subversive. আমরা যেটা দেখলাম, যেটা নিয়ে আমরা আলোচনা করেছি, এই যে যতটা স্পেস যা যা কিছু ক্যালিবানকে আলটিমেটলি হি ইজ বিং কন্টেইনড, কিন্তু সেই স্পেসটা তো দেওয়া হচ্ছে সেই স্পেসটা আছে বলেই একটা পর্যায়ে গিয়ে it is also susceptible to several other kinds of reading, different rereadings. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free. So when he says let your indulgence, so your appreciation, that symbiosis. So Elizabethan theatre is public theatre. There is a symbiotic reciprocal relation with the people. এই আমরা emergence of the public sphere নিয়ে অনেক কথা বলেছি, 18th century কনটেক্সটে বলেছি, but gradually it is germinating, এবং যার ফলেই নিও হিস্টোরিসিস্টরা বলছেন that the state was acutely aware of the ideological potential of theatre, যে এই থিয়েটারের সঙ্গে শহর, নতুন করে শহর অ্যান্ড শহরের কম্পোজিশন বদলাচ্ছে। থিয়েটারে একেবারে এক পেনি দিয়ে যারা দেখছে সেখান থেকে আলাদা করে থিয়েটার is sort of breaking down different hierarchies, and this new composite city culture, theatre is the representative of that culture. ফলে এই একটা বড় অংশের লোককে একসঙ্গে সে অ্যাড্রেস করতে পারছে। তো ফলে এবং তার ইন্ডালজেন্সে তাদের এখন আর অবভিয়াসলি দেয়ার ওয়ার স্টিল স্পন্সর্স অ্যান্ড পেট্রন সো অন অ্যান্ড সো ফোর্থ, কিন্তু ইট ইজ public indulgence in the form of money, in the form of, so it is also about public patronage. সবাই এসে দেখছে তবে চলছে। So it is a mutual reciprocal relation. ফলে আমরা যখন এই মেটা থিয়েট্রিক্যালিটির কথা উঠবে, then you have to talk about what we understand by meta theatricality, এবং obviously different components within the play which should be considered. The play itself is structured, framed in a meta-theatrical manner. How the theatrical space, it's an alternative cartography. It is sort of a recreation, presentation of the world. How it can create a microcosm of the world. এবং এটা কিভাবে হচ্ছে? How in this theatrical world, in the same way, এটা নিয়ে আমরা আগে আলোচনা করেছি, that this entire idea of, in the biblical schema, the creator and creation. In this theatrical world also you have this author God, এবং যার মধ্যে তার একদিকে the authorial intention and execution gradually coming together. দুজনের কথা একজন বলেছিলেন ইনিগো জোন্স, প্রসপেরোর কথা বলতে গিয়ে another very important figure, এটা নিয়ে পরের দিন আরেকটু কথা বলবো কারণ প্রসপেরো নিয়ে কথা বলতে হবে, that is John Dee, who was at that point of time, he was an alchemist, he was supposed to be a magician, very interesting. এবং আমরা রেনেসাঁস দেখলে এই যে বলছিলাম তখনও অবধি এই যে দিস ক্লিয়ার ডিভিশন বিটুইন হোয়াট ইজ নলেজ অ্যান্ড হোয়াট ইজ নন নলেজ, হোয়াট ইজ সায়েন্স অ্যান্ড হোয়াট ইজ ম্যাজিক, দিস ডিভিশনস আর কামিং ইন টু বিং, দে আর নট ক্লিয়ারলি ডিফাইন্ড। কারণ কি সায়েন্সও অনেক নতুন নতুন জিনিস, তখন এমন জিনিস সে জানছে যেগুলো তার আগে ইট মাইট হ্যাভ বিন might have been thought to be purely magical, impossible things. সায়েন্স সেই জিনিসগুলোকে নতুন নতুন জিনিস জানছে, শিখছে, ফলে দিস ক্লিয়ার ডিমার্কেশন ওয়াজন্ট দেয়ার। অ্যালকেমি আর সায়েন্সের মধ্যে ডিমার্কেশন was not there. So John Dee was sort of, a Faustian figure. He was sort of a very interesting figure. A lot of Shakespeare was really interested in him. His life, his works were part of the public discourse. People were interested, they would read. But at the same time, he was a highly suspected figure. এবং একটা সময় গিয়ে জন ডি তার এই যে in the same way that Caliban constantly destroy his books, John Dee's house was burned down and his books were all destroyed. তাহলে এবং জন ডি ইজ দ্য টিপিক্যাল রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভ অফ দিস ম্যাগাস ফিগার। আমরা এটা নিয়ে প্রসপেরো নিয়ে আলোচনা করার সময় কথা বলেছিলাম যে হাউ দিস নিউ নলেজ, রেনেসাঁ হিউম্যানিজম, তার নলেজ এবং তার সঙ্গে সঙ্গে দিস দ্য ক্লাসিক্যাল নলেজ অ্যান্ড দ্য নলেজ বিয়ন্ড, দুটো একসঙ্গে এসে এই যে ফিগার অফ দ্য নলেজেবল ওয়ান, দ্য ম্যাগাস ইজ অলসো আ কনজিউরার। জন ডির মধ্যে এই সবকটা জিনিস ইজ দ্য টিপিক্যাল রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভ অফ দ্য ম্যাগাস ফিগার, যে হু ইজ দ্য হারবিঞ্জার অফ নলেজ বাট হু ক্যান অলসো কনজিউর, রিক্রিয়েট a new world by sort of employing his knowledge. শুধু নলেজ থাকাই যথেষ্ট নয়, হাউ টু এক্সিকিউট, হাউ টু এমপ্লয়। প্রসপেরোর মধ্যে ইনিগো জোন্স, জন ডি, এদের we sort of get reflections of both of these figures, and both are, there is only one common thing about these two figures, and that is the ability to recreate, to represent our natural reality. The theater হচ্ছে সেই জায়গা as far as the Tempest is concerned. আমরা কারণ আমাদের যে জিনিসগুলো, কারণ কি আমাদের যেহেতু সময় আছে কিছুটা, ধরো I wanted to talk to you about better theatricality. I would like to gender নিয়ে কিছু কথা বলেছি, কিন্তু অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমরা তো sort of মিরান্ডা আর ফার্দিনান্দ রিলেশন, এটা নিয়ে আমরা খুব বেশি we didn't deal with it. তারপর ধরো আমি কিছুটা তোমাদের বলেছিলাম দ্য কানেকশন বিটুইন the Tempest and capitalism, early modernity, colonialism and capitalism, but that could be explored a little bit more. এবং কিছু কিছু খুব স্পেসিফিক টেক্সট আমার যেগুলো for example you need to make references to those texts. তোমাদের এখন এম এর আনসার তো ন্যাচারালি একটু ধারে ভারে একটুখানি বেশ জবরদস্ত হতে হবে, তো সেই আর কি। সো এবং অবভিয়াসলি যেটা আমাদের, কারণ কি এখনো অব্দি লেকচারগুলো সর্ট অফ আমি বকে গেছি, কিন্তু ইয়োর ইনপুটস অ্যান্ড ইটস ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট দ্যাট ইউ স্পিক আপ এবং ইয়োর রিডিংস অফ দ্য প্লে। We can all discuss all about that in the next class, next few classes, as far as your home assignment is concerned. I'm going to have next Monday, in any case we are meeting, so that day আমি তাহলে তোমাদের কিভাবে কি করতে হবে না হবে আর লেট ইউ, কারণ কি আমার এই বুধবার মিট করার কথা ছিল, এই বুধবার তো ছুটি।
আপনি সেকেন্ড পয়েন্ট বলেছেন না, এই স্ট্রাকচার মাইক্রোকোজম ওয়ান এন্ড কার্টোগ্রাফি কি হোয়াট
না, আমি বললাম the stage itself becomes in the same way that cartography, maps give you an alternative representation of the world. The stage itself is treated as a map, which can give you a representation, an alternative representation of the world outside. ঠিক আছে, ঠিক যেমনভাবে একটা ম্যাপ দিচ্ছে একটা 2 ডাইমেনশনাল রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন, স্টেজ একটা 3 ডাইমেনশনাল রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন দিচ্ছে। কিন্তু এই যে নতুন পৃথিবী, নিউ স্পেসেস, যেটাকে তুমি লন্ডনে বসে তুমি জানতে পারছো কিন্তু তুমি ছুঁতে পারছো না, দেখতে পারছো না, দ্য স্টেজ ক্যান গিভ ইউ দ্যাট সেন্সুয়াল এক্সপেরিয়েন্স অফ দ্য আউটসাইড ওয়ার্ল্ড। ম্যাপে তেমন তুমি নতুন ওয়ার্ল্ড যে পৃথিবীতে অনেকে যাচ্ছে, তুমি জানছো যাচ্ছে, তুমি দেখতে পাচ্ছ না। ম্যাপ তোমাকে একটা টু ডাইমেনশনাল রেপ্রেজেন্টেশন দিচ্ছে, স্টেজও ওই রকমভাবেই একটা অল্টারনেটিভ রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন অফ দ্যাট স্পেস।
এটা অল্টারনেটিভ রিপ্রেজেন্টেশনটাও তো একেবারেই মানে ইউরোপিয়ান পার্সপেক্টিভের উপর
অ্যাবসলিউটলি, আমরা এর নিয়ে কোনো সন্দেহই নেই, কিন্তু সেই ইউরোপিয়ান পার্সপেক্টিভের মধ্যে এদেরকে ঢোকা অবশ্যই একটা পার্সপেক্টিভ থাকে আনডাউটেডলি, কিন্তু ঢুকে তো পড়ছে। যেই তুমি ঢুকে একবার ওই যে বললাম দ্য ফোর্স অফ থিয়েটার, এই যে বলছে না ইট ক্যান ফ্রি ইউ, এই যে ফ্রিইং দ্য থিয়েট্রিক্যাল ফোর্স ওয়ান্স ইট ইজ রিলিজ, এটা সবসময় ওয়ান ডাইমেনশনাল কন্ট্রোল থাকছে না। আচ্ছা অয়ন, তুমি দুটো জিনিস বলছিলে, একটা প্রসপেরো নিয়ে কি বলছিলে? আর্কিওপেলাজিক আজকে গোটা ডাউন, আর্কিওপেলাজিকটা আমি পরের দিন আই স্টার্ট উইথ দ্যাট। প্রসপেরো বেনিফোলেন্ট পেটার্নালিজম মানে কি? টু হ্যাভ আ ফাদার ফিগার, ফাদার অ্যাজ বেনিফ্যাক্টর। যেভাবে আমরা ইউজুয়ালি বাবাকে দেখি নাকি, যে বাবা would simultaneously sort of the father as a controlling figure, তোমাকে বলবে হ্যাঁ এটা করো সেইটা করো না, বাট অ্যাট দ্য সেম টাইম ফর ইউর ওন বেনিফিট, ইটস দ্য আইডিয়া। এবার দিস পার্টিকুলার আইডিয়া অফ দ্য benevolent paternal figure, আমরা যদি if we look at the sort of New Testament, the biblical scheme, this idea of the Christian God as a benefactor, beneficial father figure, it is at the center of that. এটা কিন্তু আমরা ওল্ড টেস্টামেন্ট থেকে নিউ টেস্টামেন্টে এসো, যেখানে গিয়ে কিনা the from a vengeful God to a graceful God, এই যে ব্যাপারটা আসছে দেখবে ওল্ড টেস্টামেন্টে আমরা ইয়েহোভা বলো বা আমরা যাই বলি না কেন, ইটস এন ফোর্স অফ নেচার এবং ইটস এন অ্যাংরি গড। থিঙ্ক অ্যাবাউট দ্য ওল্ড টেস্টামেন্ট গড, যে এবং সে কী কী করছে। হ্যাঁ, সে ইজিপশিয়ানদের মানে শাস্তি দেবার জন্য অল চিলড্রেন অফ ইজিপ্ট আর কিল্ড, লোকাস সেন্ড করছে, ফ্লাড সেন্ড করছে। হ্যাঁ, যে মানে তার যে পানিশমেন্ট, দিস ইজ আ পানিশমেন্ট হুইচ ইজ নট, তার মধ্যে অন্য কিছু এই যে ফরগিভনেসের আইডিয়া, ইটস আ মানে ইটস আ গড হু ইজ বেসিক্যালি ফোর্স অফ নেচার ইন আ ওয়ে। কিন্তু আমরা বাই দ্য টাইম এই যে নিউ টেস্টামেন্ট এরা এবং দ্যাট টু রিফর্মেশন, পোস্ট রেফর্মেশন, যে গডের চেহারা উঠে আসছে নিউ টেস্টামেন্ট গড, তিনি কি আ বেনিভোলেন্ট ফাদার ফিগার, একটা ফাদার ফিগার যে কিনা হি ইজ কন্ট্রোলিং ইউ, হি ইজ গিভিং ইউ ডিরেকশন, হি হ্যাজ সার্টেন কোডস, হি হ্যাজ সার্টেন সেট প্যারামিটার্স, বাট অনলি ফর ইউর ওন বেনিফিট। যার ফলেই even after the fall, Adam and Eve is punished, but there is scope for redemption, there is scope for grace. তাহলে এই যে idea of this Christian God, now it is being replicated in Christian idea of sovereignty, Christian idea of kingship. কারণ কি আমি আস্তে আস্তে কিন্তু slowly but surely পার্লামেন্টে উঠছে, পার্লামেন্ট is becoming very important. ফলে দ্য কিং নিডস এ সার্টেন অ্যামাউন্ট অফ ইডিওলজিক্যাল ব্যাকিং, ইডিওলজিক্যাল লেজিটিমেশন। আমি যাইছেই করছি, কিন্তু আই এম সিম্পলি আ রিফ্লেকশন অফ ডিভাইন উইল। সুতরাং আমি যা বলবো, তোমাকে এখন পার্লামেন্টকে ভাই মানিয়ে গুছিয়ে চলতে হবে, উইল অফ দ্য পিপল আস্তে আস্তে আসছে, নট কমন পিপল, সিলেক্টেড ফিউ, কিন্তু রাদার কার্টেলড সভরেনিটি। ফলে সেখানে ইডিওলজিক্যালি তোমাকে কি এস্টাবলিশ করতে হচ্ছে, এই যে বেনিভোলেন্ট পেটার্নালিজম, যে আমি দ্য কিং ইজ নট মিয়ারলি আ সিম্বল অফ ডিভাইন উইল, দ্য কিং ইজ অলসো ফাদার ফিগার আর নার্চারার। একটা ক্লাসিক এক্সাম্পল হবে তোমাদের চেনা টেক্সটের মধ্যে থেকে ম্যাকবেথ অ্যান্ড ডানকান, তাই না? দেখবে বারবার করে ডানকান কামস আপ অলমোস্ট অ্যাজ অ্যান অ্যান্ড্রোজিনাস ফিগার। দেখবে মানে ডানকান ম্যাকবেথকে বলছে আই হ্যাভ নার্চার্ড ইউ। নার্চারিং আমরা বলি মা, it's a maternal instinct, typically speaking. কিন্তু ডানকানের মধ্যে দিস ফাদার এবং এই যে দিস ভায়োলেশন অফ দিস the contract between the benevolent paternal king and his people, এই যেটা ব্রেক করছে, দিস ইজ দ্য স্যাক্রিলেজ দেয়ার। ঠিক আছে, তাহলে এই খ্রিশ্চান আইডিয়া অফ গড replicated in the Christian post-Reformation idea of kingship, সেইটাই is again being replicated in the colonial dynamics, becoming a cultural legitimation for colonialism. একেবারে খ্রিশ্চান স্কিম অফ খ্রিশ্চান ওয়ার্ল্ড ভিউ থেকে তুলে আছে যে ভাই আমি থোড়াই তোকে মারার জন্য এসেছি, আমাই ব্যাড পারসন, তুই কিছু, ইউ আর আ বারবেরিয়ান, you are uncivilized, you don't know anything from anything, so I am here to, I might be a bit strict in the same way God is. তোমাদের মিল্টনকে দেখো, সেটান কি করেছে না করেছে, এক ধাক্কা মেরেছে পুরো একেবারে, আরে ousted from heaven. অ্যাডাম ইভ কি একটুখানি একটা আপেল খেয়েছে, যাও ফেরো, হ্যাঁ তোমার অনেক দিন পর, ঠিক আছে, there is scope for redemption, আসবেন একজন কেউ, তুমি তো তখন মরে হেজে যাবে, ঠিক আছে, but your people through his sacrifice they would be redeemed. এবং এখন যেটা ফিজিক্যাল হেভেন তোমার হাত থেকে চলে যাচ্ছে দেখি, স্পিরিচুয়ালি উইল গেট ইট ব্যাক, এটা আশ্বাস টাশ্বাস দিয়ে বাড়ি বাড়িয়ে দিচ্ছে। কলোনিয়ালিজমের ক্ষেত্রে তো তাই হচ্ছে যে ভাই আমি তোকে তোর জমি থেকে সরাচ্ছি, সে কি এমনি, তুই কি জানিস নাকি কিছু? ডু ইউ নো হাউ টু ইউজ ইউর land? I know. I might be a little strict. 1000কে মারছি, ঠিক আছে, but then I am also benevolent. I am bringing the light of knowledge to you, light of civilization to you. So এই ফলে দেখো প্রসপেরো কিন্তু ক্যালিবানের বাবার মতো, প্রসপেরো নার্চার্স ক্যালিবান। প্রসপেরো বারবার বলছে হি ইজ লাইক আ সান টু মি, ওকে এনেছিল, ওকে লালন পালন করেছে, কিন্তু উইথ সার্টেন বাউন্ডারিজ। সেই বাউন্ডারি কখন ক্যালিবান ক্রস করলো? ওয়েন ইট কামস টু উইমেন, জেন্ডার, ব্যাস হয়ে গেল, বাবা আর বাবা নেই। হ্যাঁ, সো দ্যাট ইজ দ্য রুল অফ দ্য ফাদার। তাহলে ওই প্রসপেরো ইজ সর্ট অফ দিস বেনিভোলেন্ট, মানে প্রসপেরোর মধ্যে খুব ইন্টারেস্টিংলি ইউ হ্যাভ আ কম্বিনেশন of both the Old Testament idea of God and the New Testament idea of God. This benevolent paternal figure, but also this fearful, vengeful God of the Old Testament who unleashes his anger and his vengefulness on the people. But at the end of it, that Christian grace is restored. So that is how the Christian God or New Testament God, সেখান থেকে নিউ টেস্টামেন্ট রেফরমেশন আইডিয়া অফ কিংশিপ, নিউ সফরেনিটি, a more contained idea of sovereignty emerging, and that idea of sovereignty then being replicated on a civilizational scale in the context of colonialism. And as far as Prospero is concerned, আমরা দেখছি এই দুটোই, মানে এই ওল্ড টেস্টামেন্ট আর নিউ টেস্টামেন্ট গডের একটা অদ্ভুত কম্বিনেশন আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি প্রসপেরো। আর কে ভুলে আছি? Next. হ্যাঁ, এটা দেখুন।
Shinjini di 29th November.
The notion of China. Today we are going to talk about one of the major themes of the faith, and that is the question of power, which is sort of at the center of the text. Question of power, question of authority. So how the text deals with the operations of power, or how it represents operations of power. Now, I mean, if you look at the text, at the heart of it is the question of sovereign authority. Prospero, whose sovereign authority has been usurped by someone else, his brother, establishes his authority over the island. And here you have, when the shipwreck happens, there is also the sovereign power. That is the king of Naples. He is also there. So the question of sovereign authority, if we look a little bit at the text, that particular portion where Prospero sort of tells Act 1, Scene 2, where Prospero tells Miranda about their past. There, look at the language. Yes. So he's saying how he was, his throne was usurped, how he was betrayed by his brother, and how he was sort of completely, he was interested in studies, he completely busied himself with his studies, and how he sort of relegated some of his responsibilities to his brother, and how he sort of gradually he hatches a conspiracy. Hence, and this because of the delegation of some power, some authority, he says, hence his ambition growing to have no screen between this part he played and him he played it for. The part he played and him he played it for, he needs will be absolute Milan. Now, before that, he has called himself, thy father was the Duke of Milan. But here, look at the phrasing, absolute Milan. The body of the sovereign and that of the state become one and identical. Okay, so it is the question of authority, sovereign authority, is intrinsically linked to the question of the performance of sovereignty. Performance of sovereignty. So, the body, the individual body of the king, of the sovereign, and the role of the sovereign. These two are different from one another, and yet these are constantly conflated into one another, to the extent that the king starts to represent, the sovereign starts to represent the stability of the state. So, consequently, any kind of sort of destabilization of sovereignty, it is subsequently, it is seen as a destabilization of the state power. So, the idea of the state, and this is where you have already, I think, as far as Renaissance is concerned, when we are talking about different kinds of power, different operations of power in the text, number one is the operation of sovereign power. Operations of power. Act number, sovereign power. The authority of the sovereign thwarted, and then and the same sovereign authority Prospero tries to establish on the island. However, in each case, and this is important, the sovereign power is constantly projected in a given centrality, but the sovereign power is never uncontested. In the case of Milan, this absolute conflation between the king, the body king and kingship, okay, that itself, this performance of the role of the king when it is challenged and it is taken up by someone else, it doesn't remain uncontested. So it's contested by his brother. On the island, yes, Prospero tries to sort of establish an absolute authority, but again it is not uncontested. So the ownership, the sovereign, who does the sovereign power of the island lies with, there is constant contestation. There is a counter argument put forward by Caliban. And then very interestingly, you have the other sovereign power, that is Naples, the king of Naples. You would find somewhere in Act 2 the same kind of conspiracy that had dethroned Prospero. A similar conspiracy is being not exactly hatched, not to that extent, but at least contemplated when in Act 2, between Act 2 and Act 3, obviously the king and his courtiers are on one side of the island. Ferdinand is on the other side of the island. So they don't know that Ferdinand is alive. In fact, and the king is very, very sad, he is morose, he thinks that his only son is and only heir to the throne is dead. And you have the same kind of equation that you have between Prospero and Antonio, the two brothers. And one sovereign brother and one prospective sovereign, the ambitious brother. The same kind of equation exists between King of Naples, Alonso, and his brother Sebastian. And there we have a hint. When they think, there is Sebastian, there is Antonio, and a couple of others, when they think that, the heir to the throne is possibly dead, Ferdinand is possibly dead. So the heir is very important. Again, we are not only talking about the individual Ferdinand. We are not talking about the son of a father. We are talking about the heir apparent. So there is a sovereign function to be performed. And when that function is questioned, it is ultimately a crisis of kingship. And again, consequently a crisis of the state. And so there is, on the one hand, a possible crisis at this point of time they are thinking, there is this possible crisis that there is no heir apparent. But these people are also trying to take advantage of it, and Antonio is sort of proposing the similar kind of, he is making similar kinds of propositions to Sebastian, what he had done earlier. So this contested sovereignty, it runs throughout the play. It had happened 12 years earlier in Milan. It's happening on the island. It is also happening, there is also a prospect which ultimately does not take place. Now, if we look at the Renaissance political philosophy, and I'm sure you know a little bit of it by now, particularly, we keep talking about the new historicists and the cultural materialists. So basically, both were offshoots of Marxist school of historical criticism. Cultural materialists, mainly British group of scholars, and neo historicists American, but mainly more or less the same. Who, as I said, who tried to look at Renaissance texts in the broader context, broader social, cultural, and political context. Now, what they do, when we look at a Renaissance text, there has always been a very, very strong, centrality in Renaissance political philosophy, in Renaissance social codes of behavior, of order and hierarchy is given centrality. Order and hierarchy. There is a constant thrust on order and hierarchy. Now there are lots of historians who think that these texts, Renaissance texts, they kind of reflect, they are sort of hegemonic tools. They reflect the state state, the hegemony of the state's, unitary vision of centralized power and order, homogeneous order, the texts reflect that. I mean, think about your Macbeth. Ultimately, it is about the rightful sovereign being restored. There is this kind of a very, very rigid framework, an order, almost a cosmic order, because the king is supposed to be a divine representation. So the king's body, there is this very famous book by Kantorowicz called The King's Two Bodies of the king. So there is the corporeal body of the king, and then there is the divine body. So the corporeal body is, perishable, but the divine body of the king. Think about that. That very, very common adage: "The king is dead, long live the king." What does that mean? The king cannot die. The individual might, but king as in the performance, the function of the king, and the person who performs the role of the king, that position, that cannot go vacant. So in Renaissance worldview, there is a centrality to order and authority, and often there are historians who look at sort of Renaissance texts as this kind of a reflection of the state philosophy and sort of the state's discourse. But cultural materialists, particularly there is a very important book by Jonathan Dollimore called Political Shakespeare, which is it's edited, not by Jonathan Dollimore, edited by Jonathan Dollimore. Okay. And there is a very important, we will refer to that essay and I will share that essay with you. There is a very important essay on Tempest, but that basically deals with colonialism, so I am right now not taking that up. But if you look at the introduction, given by Jonathan Dollimore, Dollimore very clearly says, or he argues, that Renaissance texts, they are not mere vehicles of state propaganda. They are not there is no one-to-one correlation between the structures of power and expression of culture. But at the same time, culture has very, very complex relationship with power. That is undeniable. But it is not the Renaissance texts. They do not simply express the philosophy of the state. There are other things. There are other components. There are other ideological elements. And the text always is a contested field. Dollimore quotes another historian called Lawrence Stone. I'm not going into that. But the main point is late 16th and early 17th century. These were marked by sort of a hysterical demand for order, as I was telling you, in society, in politics. So, there's this very strange sort of parallel between the Copernican cosmic order and the Renaissance social order. So, by this time, from the Ptolemaic world, we have sort of gradually, again, it is contested. The church is obviously against it, but slowly, already have the notion, from what we call a Ptolemaic cosmic order to a Copernican cosmic order. Okay, in from a geocentric order to a cosmic order to a heliocentric cosmic order. That is an order where the sun is at the center and there's planetary movements around the sun. So the same kind of structure was imagined in terms of the political and social order, where the king, the sovereign, is at the center, the sun, and there are ranks, there are others around him. And this is sort of a centripetal. There is constant movement towards the center. It is the center that very closely holds everything together. So it's the center which is it is the axis which keeps the entire order still. So throughout late 16th, early 17th century, it's there. And there is through Renaissance literature, Renaissance, sort of culture of the Renaissance court, Renaissance philosophy, there is constant legitimation and validation of the status quo, stability, constantly. But where Dollimore sort of, it's there. But Dollimore says that, it is not a single political vision. It is not this overarching control of the state. Dollimore says we should not look at it as the unchallenged authority and power of the state. Rather, it is state's response to a very, very drastically and radically changing world outside. The idea is, what Jonathan Dollimore is arguing is that this overarching power of the state controlling everything from the center, Dollimore says it might come across as if this is the unchallenged power of the state. State eto powerful যে সবকিছু কন্ট্রোল করছে, কিন্তু in reality এই যে excessive control, this is actually the state's sort of knee-jerk reaction to a world that is radically changing. একটা এমন পৃথিবী যেটা খুব দ্রুত, খুব তাড়াতাড়ি বদলাচ্ছে। এবার এটা সব জায়গায় কখন একটা স্টেট অথরিটেরিয়ান হয়, আরো বেশি বড় অথরিটি, you try to assert your power even more when you know that there are too many changes around you. Too many changes which are beyond your control. So you want to control them even more. So Dollimore says that this centrality of order in the Renaissance discourse, in Renaissance literature, in Renaissance philosophy, instead of looking at it as unchallenged power of the state, we should look at it as state's response to other, to radical changes in society, to other forces. And those forces are very much there. What kind of changes are we looking at? First of all, that entire medieval world order is breaking down. Okay, so the medieval notion of kingship, the medieval sort of the feudal order, it is kind of going through, we are now talking about the early modern period, it is kind of going through a phase of transformation. Sort of a new merchant class is on the rise. There is their profession. So the merchant class, the professional class, the new kind of economic activities, all of these things are reshaping the class structure and class relations. Particularly the gentry, what was understood as the gentry. The shape, size, composition of that gentry is going through change. Number two, the other very important factor is that there is if you look at the medieval world, there are two figures of authority. One is the king, the other is the church. Both are now, we are talking about early 17th century, post-Reformation, both have gone through very, very significant challenges. Okay, so for for people of the Renaissance, challenges to authority is not unseen. In fact, it is something many of them have seen in their own lifetime. So it is in the face of those kind of challenges that we see there is a renewed effort on the part of the state to legitimize its power. And so you have this constant emphasis on authority, on sovereignty. But again, and this is what Dollimer says in Political Shakespeare, that Shakespeare keeps his space, the literary space, the space of theatre, a contested field by allowing all these other ideological components, allowing space there. Theatre, something that we had already discussed in the last class, it was very, very powerful. Public theatre. So the state was also well aware of the hegemonic power of theatre, but also the subversive power of theatre. So theatre was used or could be used to propagate the hegemony of the state, propagate the philosophy of the state, but the state was also well aware that theatre could it could project power, it could represent power, but it could also demystify power to the extent that it can subvert power. So this potential, this subversive potential of theatre remained, more or less with all Renaissance playwright, and here we are talking about Shakespeare. Also remember, The Tempest when it was written, the Jacobean England, it was already a period of transformation. After the prolonged and sort of stable sovereign rule of Elizabeth, it went through a crisis of state crisis of lineage. Who's going to inherit the throne? And after that, as I said, the two institutions of authority, the church, the Catholic Church was already contested, and the king was already facing contestation from a gradually, empowered parliament. So from the time of Henry VIII, parliament was slowly and surely, and these two are interconnected. The rise, the Reformation, this kind of a challenge to the authority. Remember, when we are talking about challenge to the Catholic Church, we are also talking about challenge to the political authority, not just the religious authority, but political authority of the Pope. And by now the entire Christendom is kind of divided between Catholics and Protestants. And if you look at it very carefully, Protestantism gained ground in sort of those countries which were also opening up. These were primarily mercantile countries. England, Netherlands. Okay, these countries gradually, though it started, obviously, Lutheranism started in Germany, in various city-states of Germany, and it had considerable support of these mercantile, the state and the mercantile community. So it did have, because these are the states that they also wanted to challenge, they also wanted to regain sovereign power. They wanted to establish their sovereign power, complete sovereign power, as opposed to the, sharing it with the Pope and the Catholic Church. But so in England, from the time of Henry VIII, we know gradually Parliament started gaining power. By the time we come to the King James's time, and when this was the Tempest was being composed, there is the relation between the king and the Parliament is already confrontational. Particularly, the Parliament was not at all happy with the fiscal policy of James. It was being challenged. The financial rights of the king they were being argued as he was thought to be very financially very irresponsible as a king, over expenditure of royalty. All those questions Shakespeare was living at a time, and this play was being written at a time when the divine power of kingship and the authority, sovereign authority of the king was already challenged. Okay, So the challenges to authority, sovereignty as a contested field, what we see in the text, it has serious real life reverberation in society. Just a few years back, Tempest, as you know, was written around maybe 1610. Between 1608 and 1611, there was a crisis of kingship in Bohemia, not in England, in Bohemia. King Rudolf II of Bohemia, he lost control of Austria. Austria, Hungary, Moravia, Bohemia, all this is complete his empire. He lost control as he was dethroned by his brother. So it's a very, very clear, immediate, and what happened in Bohemia, it sort of had, because there were other kings, other rulers in other European states, so it obviously it created ripple across Europe. So there was an immediate historical, contemporary reference point of loss of sovereignty, challenges to sovereignty, which might have had direct impact on the play. But this question, these contestations regarding sovereignty, even recurs in Shakespeare. An obvious reference is Macbeth. But another, closer parallel is Hamlet. Because in Hamlet also, the same thing happened. The rightful king who was killed. Actually, it was a conspiracy, and again, it's a brother that killed him. So this kind of runs through the Shakespearean canon. Now, when we are talking about this kind of the theatrical text as a contested field, we can also take recourse to Raymond Williams, the Marxist historian. Raymond Williams' famous book, Marxism and Literature. But Williams says that at any given point of time, literature, in cultural forms, there are three kinds of cultural forms that exist within the field of culture. And he named these three: residual, dominant, and emerging. Residual, dominant, and emerging. What does he mean? He is saying that, look, he is looking at this entire history from a class perspective. And he says, look, when we are talking about, historical materialism, when we are talking about historical changes in class composition, that does not happen on one day. Forget about class. When we are talking about, you go back to the history of English literature. When you are talking about Old English and Middle English, a question is regularly posed: when does the Middle English period start? And you say 1066. What does it even mean? Is it so that one fine morning of 1066, the world changes? So yes, we kind of specific historical events, we take them as yardsticks, change. But society changes over a period of time. It's a slow process, and there's a long period of transition. So Williams says that, in society at any given point of time, you have elements, in any given society, you have elements, components from a past society, continued as far as culture is concerned, in the contemporary culture of a particular age. You have, on the one hand, residues, certain remnants, continuation of cultural elements of a previous social order. That's what he calls residual. Then you have dominant. That is, any sort of class society, you have a particular group, a particular social group, a particular social class gaining economic power along with that political power. So it gains dominance. It starts to dominate the discourse. The moment it gains economic power, it wants political power, and then it wants to continue that political power that hold on society, and culture is the best way to do it. So that is the dominant discourse, dominant culture of a particular society. And then there is emerging. So the dominant discourse, the dominant power in no society is completely unchallenged. There are already elements in society which is trying to counteract, which is trying to challenge. Maybe those are social groups which will eventually come into power. So, for example, if you look at the Renaissance, it already have the dominant social group is still the aristocracy. Okay, the king, and which is why you have the dominant state discourse of the centrality of the king, something that we have been talking about, and the kind of order it wants to establish, it wants to continue. You have residues from the medieval times. You have residual sort of elements, cultural elements continue. But you already have an emerging class. You have the commercial class, you have the merchant class, and already there are, so the dominant discourse of state centrality and sovereign centrality is there, but you already have in the fact that the cultural texts, they are making way, they are making space for counter discourses, for emerging discourses. Okay, so in the same way that the king's sovereignty is being contested by the parliament, new kind of, a very different kind of social order slowly but surely is coming, where the traditional class structures are about to change, on the verge of change. Those changes are already indicated in the literary text, in the cultural field of culture. Okay. Now, another thing, so when we are talking about the state, the sovereign state, there are two absolutely central images of the text. One is obviously the island. And the island becomes, as I said, the space to put, bring together all these different social relations. Where sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty, the idea of authority can be discussed and challenged and counteracted. Right? So you have, a master, you have king, you have kingship, you have other forms of authority. We'll come to that in a moment. But there is the island, obviously. The other central symbol is that of the ship. And the ship, when we see the ship for the first time, it is a ship out of control. And throughout Renaissance literature, often we come across this kind of parallel. The ship has a metaphor for the state. So in the same way that a state needs to be controlled and steered in the right direction by the sovereign, so does the ship. So a ship out of control, sort of it metaphorically represents a state out of control. Challenge, contestation of sovereign power. There is this very famous ode by Horace. Now Horace's odes are usually just numbered. But this particular ode, when it was translated, this is about, there is a central image of the ship, and he is asking the ship to come back to the harbor because it has gone through this terrible storm near the coast of Africa, etc. So the original ode was just numbered. But as you know, Renaissance is also the time when the classical texts, Latin texts, are extensively translated. So most of the English translators translated this ode and gave it the title To the Ship of State.
ম্যাডাম একটু আসবো সরি টুমোরো আমাদের পিএইচডি অ্যাডমিশন টেস্ট আছে ক্লাস হওয়ার পসিবিলিটি খুব কম 11:30 আমি লাইব্রেরিয়ানকে বলেছি 11:30 লাইব্রেরিতে ক্লাস হবে 11:30 to 1:30 এই মানসিক প্রিপারেশন নিয়ে আসবে। তারপর যদি ইফ পসিবল এখানে ক্লাস করানো আমরা ক্লাস করবো। যদি কোনো মাস্টারমশাই 9:30 ক্লাস নিতে চান সেটা হতে পারে, কিন্তু 11টা থেকে 1:30 পর্যন্ত চান্স নেই। ওই টাইমটা বেস্ট ইউজ হলো লাইব্রেরিতে তোমরা যাচ্ছ, আমিও যাবো, অ্যাটেন্ডেন্স দেবো, আগের দিন অ্যাটেন্ডেন্সটাও দিয়ে দেবো, ঠিক আছে? এইটা তোমরা কমিউনিকেট করো সবার সঙ্গে, হোল ডিপার্টমেন্ট। এখন আর কেউ নেই, কোনো ডিপার্টমেন্ট কোনো ইয়ারে ক্লাস স্টুডেন্টস নেই, কিন্তু যাদের সঙ্গে দেখা হবে তোমরা বলে দেবে। ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ।
So the play directs us, this sort of the ship in the turmoil, it kind of again projects this idea of sovereignty, the state, in turmoil. Ultimately, by the end of the, and this is again something that happens everywhere, that happens in Macbeth, that happens everywhere. At the end, there is some kind of a restoration. There is sort of renegotiation of the, players of power, and there is restoration of order. But in the meantime, the areas of contestation and limits of power are exposed. Right? If you have read the play, you'll see again a portion which is clear parallel with Macbeth. This is Act 4, that mask. Before that mask, there is a banquet. Prospero calls the others at a banquet, and it is at this banquet, the banquet is disrupted. Because it is in that banquet that through Ariel, through his spirits, Prospero questions and tries to expose the usurpers. His own brother as well as the potential usurper, that is Sebastian. So, think about the interrupted banquet of Macbeth. Remember the banquet scene. Every time Macbeth tries to sit at the head of the table, it is disrupted. Because Macbeth is not the lawful sovereign. So the banquet, in a way, first of all, it is a collective feast. It is an affirmation of social relations and social order, social hierarchy. So a formal banquet, in a formal banquet, everyone's place is predetermined. Even today, you go to a formal banquet, কে কোথায় বসবে একেবারে, and this is according to order, according to station, and this kind of banquet, particularly the kind of banquet, let's say Macbeth called, it was his attempt to establish himself as the new king. The first banquet called by the new king. So he sits, it is the king who is the host, is supposed to stay at the head of the table, just like he is the head of the state. And then everybody, if you remember the banquet scene, when he comes, Macbeth, and sits at the head of the table, and then everybody stands up, nobody can sit before the king sits, and then say, all of you know your place, sit down. So everyone's place, according to who is what is, according to their title, according to their social status, and everybody sits there. The only one who doesn't find a rightful place is ironically Macbeth. Because obviously, as I said, for the Renaissance political vision, the order is very, very important. There is, as Dollimore says, almost a hysterical thrust, a constant attempt to establish order through various textual means. But so every time Macbeth wants to sit, and then it's interrupted by the ghost of the past. Okay. Here again, that is a tragedy. Obviously, here the same. Here again there is a banquet, but here also the banquet is interrupted. In the case of Macbeth, the interruption is supernatural, the ghost of banquet. Here also, the interruption is supernatural, Ariel and the spirits. And it is sort of the people who engage in the banquet, people who become part of the banquet, they are reminded of what they have done. So the banquet as an attempt, as a reflection of sovereign order, but a banquet also becomes a means to show the limits of the sovereign order, the contestations associated with the sovereign order, sovereign power. So sovereign power is one kind of, when we are talking about operations of power, there is the sovereign power. Number two is the power of knowledge. In Prospero's body, in Prospero, there are two kinds of authorities that come together. The sovereign authority and the authority of knowledge, authority of books. Prospero, again and again, there is emphasis on Prospero's relation with books. Remember Caliban, when he hatches a conspiracy with Trinculo and Stefano, he says that, I know the monster, he sleeps there, so you go in his cell, he will be all alone. He says, the first thing you should do, you should take away his books. That is the source of his magic. First you take away his books and then you kill him. So Prospero's authority to a large extent is derived from books. Okay. And in the same way that the play talks about, or Renaissance text overall talks about the limits of sovereign power, they also, on the one hand, there is this constant foregrounding of knowledge, and the knowledge gained by individual knowledge as the source of, as something that shapes, as the means of self-fashioning. I'm sure you have been told this term, Renaissance self-fashioning. Again, new historicist Stephen Greenblatt has a famous book called Renaissance self-fashioning. So the word fashion, it comes into fashion around the same time, and the idea of self-fashioning. So the self, not as something pre-given, predetermined, but as something that can be transformed, that can be changed, that can be shaped. Subjective pursuit of selfhood. And this is when, in the previous point, when I was talking about the fact that, sovereign power trying to establish itself in an ever-changing world. And I said that the medieval worldview changes drastically. One of the major changes was this. So, the medieval, till the medieval age, now, when we are talking about the medieval age, it's a very limited idea. Let us be, when we are talking about the Renaissance, for example, we forget that even before the 16th century, there were periods of, in Europe, the so-called Middle Ages. Even during that, there were periods of, cultural and creative sort of outpouring of creative energy and, cultural output. So nowadays we also talk about the 12th century Renaissance, Charlemagne, that period. So, and Renaissance is not constant, so there were phases. But give or take, when we are talking about the medieval worldview, we are talking about a worldview in which everything is predetermined. Right? Your positions, yourself, it was so the entire idea of the original sin and the idea that this life is sinful. So you are, whatever you have in your life, the kind of life you have, the kind of social status you have, the kind of person you are, it is determined, it is divine wish. So any attempt to change it would be sacrilege. Any attempt to change it would amount to going against the wish of God, the will of God. Now, by the time we come to the Renaissance, that particular point of view has changed. It does not mean, mind you, Renaissance humanism is not exactly antithetical to the idea of divinity, not at all. It is not. Most of the Renaissance humanists, many of them were actually scholasticians, religious scholars. But the idea is Renaissance humanism, particularly Neoplatonists and all, they look at human life, yes, divinely ordered, but they would counter argue that if you have intellect, if human beings have the potential to think and to change, then that potential is in us because of the divine will. Now, if you do not use that, then you are going against the divine will. So there is an attempt to combine this idea of divinity with the idea of individual pursuit. Right? And we have to understand why. We are talking about the early modern period. We are talking about a radical social economic change. A new class is coming up. This entire idea of a predestined, predetermined order, it suited the medieval feudal hierarchy, where everything was associated with land, and land was associated, it was titular from one generation to another. Now you have an emerging class, a merchant class, a commercial class, which is sort of trying to make it something out of their life. So the emerging class, also they will be gradually, by the time we'll come to 18th, 19th century, we are right now in the early phase of capitalism. By that time, we'll have 18th century proper mercantile capitalism, and this particular class, which is right now the emerging class, the dominant class is still the aristocracy. Which is why it is the aristocracy, we see them everywhere in every play, which is why the king and surrounding him all the courtiers. But there is already an emerging class putting forward counter discourse. That emerging class will become the dominant class within a century or two. Right? So, knowledge, for Renaissance, it's important to shape the subjective pursuit of the self. The self becomes very important, and it can be shaped, it can be fashioned. In fact, the entire idea of Neoplatonism is that it can be fashioned as far as there is a divine model, the ideal. And there are different stages of the being. So, the entire Petrarchan journey of the self through the sonnets, this is gradually an attempt at self, the self trying to attain that ideal state. There is no collapse, and you can never become one with the ideal. But there is always an anticipation, and in the process, there is a process of transformation through which you go in pursuit of that ideal. And knowledge is an important tool for Renaissance self-fashion. And look at the kind of knowledge. Here, the kind of knowledge we are talking about, again, a very different kind of knowledge than the medieval idea knowledge. This is not religious knowledge. This is not scholastic knowledge. This is a form of knowledge which again challenges the limits of knowledge. It is called magical. Look at Prospero. In a way, it is a new kind of knowledge. He may come across as a technocrat or as a scientist. In fact, there are adaptations of the Tempest where Prospero is imagined as sort of this mad scientist, right? Who kind of conjures up all these things out of nothing. So clearly we are living in a time of new knowledges opening up. So the idea of knowledge this is new forms of knowledge challenging the established limits of knowledge. We already have had that. Remember your Dr. Faustus, 1590s, where again the limits of knowledge, challenging the limits of knowledge and sort of moving towards an idea of dark knowledge, a knowledge which is forbidden. Okay, so here Prospero also kind of moves towards that idea of forbidden knowledge, but this is a kind of this knowledge is given some sort of legitimacy, because now we are living at a time when we have all these kind of new knowledges which are, these are happening in real life, but which, this is still a field of the unknown. It is not clearly defined. We do not know whether it's completely, they did not know at that point of time, whether it's completely good or bad. Not everything could be explained, so it's magical. It is magical and it's transformative. Okay, so the book as the source of knowledge. Again, it has also cultural reinforcement of this idea of the book as the source of knowledge through Reformation. Because Reformation also, unlike a more ritualistic performance of religion, it is Reformation in Protestantism, post-Luther, which talks about the importance of the book. Go back to the book as the sole authority. So, we are also, why so much importance given to book? Because we are entering a book culture, a book market. So, a major shift from the medieval age to the early modern age is in the change of reading culture. So, in the medieval age, you had handwritten manuscripts. Most of the people could not, and most of them were in Latin, a language which was not accessible to common people. So in the medieval age, you had this collective reading cultures, oral culture. Very few manuscripts, and maybe someone would read out or perform, orally transmit, and people would gather and they would listen. So there was a culture of collective reading. By the early modern age, particularly post-Gutenberg, we have in place what Benedict Anderson calls print capitalism. A print culture, so we are in the phase of early capitalism, but when he's talking about print capitalism, the importance of printed material, of the printing press in the dissemination of knowledge. So it is the printing press that has had a defining role in deciding what is knowledge and what is not, and what are the new forms of knowledge. Because you can no longer rely on the earlier, you have a dissemination of knowledge, the number of printed material you have, and the kind of reach it can have. It is unprecedented. So that book market, this newly emerging print capitalism and book market, makes the book, so from a culture of reading, which was oral and collective, you have now a culture of reading which is textual, which constantly refers to the written word, the book, the text, and a more individualistic pursuit of knowledge. So you can have a one-to-one correspondence with your text. So the centrality of the book, we often, again and again, you go back to the text, how many times you'll find, again and again, we see Prospero with the text. So you have the power of knowledge, you have the power of sovereign power. Number 3 is the power of language, discursive power. It is interesting to know that both the word author and authority, they have the same root. Etymologically, they can be traced back to the same root. Both basically came from the Latin word augere. It originally meant, and it's very interesting, to increase, to originate, to promote. So from there comes the Latin word octave. And then via, again it means, octave, very interesting, it means promoter, producer, father. And then in 12th century through Old French, this word comes in medieval English, and gradually, from the late 14th century, it starts to be associated. So you have author as the original composer. That didn't happen earlier. That only in the late 14th century around. Author being associated with the original composer as opposed to other forms of writers. A copyist, a translator, right? A compiler as opposed to the author. And gradually you have the author as the signatory and the centrality. So in the same way that the sovereign is at the center of the state, the social order, the textual order is around the author. So the figure of authority, Prospero, is the figure of authority, both sovereign authority and he is also the authorial figure. So the literary space, as I told you the last day, the entire story in a way is completely conjured and singularly controlled by Prospero. So Prospero, we can almost, Prospero is almost an authorial figure in that sense of the term. The figure of the author as the composer, as the originator. Okay, everything originates in him and has complete, it is his meaning, it is his voice. And he draws that power from his power of language. Think about that part when, he talks to Miranda and he tells Miranda about their past. This is a clear exercise in rhetoric. Okay, I'll stop here. I think তোমাদের class. I don't want to. সাড়ে দশটা থেকে অনন্যাদের ক্লাস. So I don't want to eat up. আমি just তাহলে এটা কেন বলছি exercise in rhetoric we'll discuss in the next class, but I think তোমাদের Thursday I'll meet you for Amit. Oh, কালকে ঠিক আছে, দেখা যায় কালকে 9:30 খালি তোমরা? ঠিক আছে, ঠিক আছে, কারণ কি কালকে আমাদের ছিল 18th century, haven't even started. যাই হোক, দেখা যায় এক্সট্রা টু ক্লাস পাওয়া যায়। তো আমি জাস্ট এইটা বলে দিই, আমি এগুলো নিয়ে আমরা আলোচনা পরে ঠিক করবো। সো পাওয়ার অফ ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ, পাওয়ার অফ ডিসকোর্স। অথর শব্দটাকে যদি দেখো, the transformation of the word author, another meaning that emerges is that of the father. So another exercise of power is the paternal power, the authority of the father and the challenges to it. Which obviously brings us to the question of gender. And then obviously the power of theatre. So there is a network of power, and these different forms of power constantly interact with each other and intersect each other. বাকিগুলো আমরা পরে ডিসকাস করব। Any questions, any observations? আমি যতক্ষণ তোমাদের
Ma'am, is this author
this would set the narrative, sort of an industrialized way of filmmaking. সেখান থেকে এবার this Truffaut and Godard and others, they started talking about the director as the sort of the center, as the guiding power, and someone. It is the signature of the director that defines a film. একেবারেই author থেকে audio play.
অনন্যাদি 12th জানুয়ারি। অনন্যাদি 12th জানুয়ারি।
Let's say Kavita chooses what? Landscape or performance history or another. At least one of them is not necessarily the first one. Kavita should be getting along those lines. Equitable. But that way at least yes, there's another writer, which means that if all 15 should have been taken by somebody or other. Moral, that is the second writer. I don't know how to do this math. It sounds very ambitious, but I'm sure you're capable of it much better than I am.
Questions will be given from all the sections.
I don't get your question.
মানে প্রিন্টগুলো তো সবগুলো আছে এবারে মানে এক্সামের জন্য মানে আমরা সবাই মিলে সবগুলো প্রিপেয়ার করলাম
না না তোমরা যে
যেটা
তুমি ধরো ল্যান্ডস্কেপ চুজ করলে তোমার তোমার প্রশ্নটা ল্যান্ডস্কেপ থেকেই হবে। So roughly, so if we have, so yeah, something like that. That means a lot of trouble for me, but I'm ready to put myself through that trouble. I know it sounds fanciful, but okay. So Baker. The reason why I chose these two essays, one of them being any further questions? Yes, dropping things and yeah. So not the best of chairs either. You know, we enjoy ourselves and peace. I didn't want to take a class in this room. I'm very like that's safer. Because it's not good because if any one of you get hurt on that, you need to take a topsoil. It's a rusted screw. So one would best be wary of it. Get it out of the way. So yeah, so I believe that I've suggested that we do of gardens and of beauty in class. There are so many others I could have chosen as kind of quintessential Bacon essays, but I wanted kind of, since you are all part of a postgraduate class, you are more into ideas in circulation in the Renaissance rather than simply, treat single authors as monoliths, isolated kind of texts or isolated cases. So these point I'm trying to make this, it will be apparent when we read Marvel's poem The Garden. Some of you may have read it, and you all read it in your undergraduate class. No. Usually the Marvel poem that is read is To His Coy Mistress, or the definition of love. We will read The Garden, and Bacon's essay of gardens makes for a wonderful intertextuality, very interesting intertextuality. Also, some of you have already come having had some experience of reading Paradise Lost. So the garden is a very, it's a very focal and signifier in Western culture, in Western literature, in English literature as well. It's a trope that keeps coming back, both in terms of, as I said, as a cultural space or concept or an idea or a construct for that matter, and therefore with a lot of ramifications, a lot of, if you like, interpretations in literary texts. So garden has a very special significance, particularly also in early modern European literature. Those of you who are interested, I'll bring those books along eventually. I hope, as I said, after the 22nd, I'll become a little more focused. A lot of work has been done by architectural historians on gardens in this period. This is a period that saw a tremendous amount of architectural, if you like, spate of architectural innovations in England. It saw the arrival of a lot of architectural, if you like, philosophers. There was a spate of, if you like, building, and this is the period that saw the building of what have come down to us as quintessential estate houses, country houses. In fact, Marvel has another poem on Appleton House, which is also of significance here. So, particularly in the 17th century, early 17th century Jacobean period, we see the rise of, or the arrival of a very of a pioneering neoclassical architect in England called Sir Christopher Wren, who's the one who built the St. Paul's Cathedral and who kind of in many ways revolutionized post-Reformation architecture. So 17th century England, in fact, Elizabethan period onwards, there's a, if you like, an architectural renaissance as well in England. And these houses would not just be houses, they would come with a lot of land. These are landed estates, country houses. So, what we are looking at is houses in relation to the nature outside, the physical environment. And so, this period also saw the rise of landscape gardening, very elaborate, very intricate, methodical, kind of, if you like, uh, not just utilization of space, harnessing of space for the manufacture of beauty. So the whole idea of manicuring, the kind of things that we associate, let's say, with the Mughal gardens in Delhi, that those concepts arrived in England around this time, late Elizabethan period, and afterwards, of course, the Jacobean period. Jacobean period because James I was a great hedonist. He lavished a lot of funds and resources on arts and architecture. He was very oriented towards that, and that is perhaps also the reason why the spate kind of picked up. And Elizabeth too, there had been this kind of convention during the long reign of Elizabeth, very extravagant, very decadent in its own way, for Elizabeth to kind of move from one country house to another, to go on visits to her different aristocratic favorites, so members of the Privy Council and so on. She would most of the time just spend her time in court. How does a feudal monarch entertain herself? uh, you know, so people from the countryside came to the city to watch plays, to go to fairgrounds, to visit the marketplace. So there's that kind of a consumerist movement back and forth between the countryside and the city. There's also a reverse movement. People were mostly situated or stationed in the city. Where would they go? Where would a monarch go? One of the films that you would also want to watch, you may watch it on your own, would be A Man for All Seasons. Sir Thomas More, he had a country house too, which none other than Henry VIII would come and visit. And there would be hunting parties, there would be entertainment in terms of, King Lear, like the fool in King Lear, entertaining the jester, all sorts of very elaborate, extravagant arrangements would be made. And something that Greenblatt talks about, which is that food would be served and then food would be taken away and put and simply just thrown away to menials. And this was seen as a kind of, if you like, an ostentatious display of wealth. People would kind of put up a huge spread of food, including multiple different types of meat and fowl. And then, wonder of wonders, that first serving would not actually be consumed. It is meant for visual satiation, and it would be taken away. It would be taken away, and then the real food would be served, which would probably be even more extravagant. So you see the whole 16th century, uh, it's not just about food, it is also about architecture. It would also have been about, miniature jewelry and, very, very intricately bejeweled artifacts that would be created as gifts, design. So this was also the heyday of design. So people would get these done, and then these aristocrats, in order to curry favor with Elizabeth, they would give Elizabeth one of these gifts, very again allegorical, very loaded, symbolic gifts as efforts to curry favor dinner with her. These would be parting gifts. So Queen Elizabeth would kind of come, from one country house to another, spend 3 months at these houses. This is also a way of cutting down her own expenses at the expense of the aristocrats. So, very exploitative, mutually or intrinsically exploitative system, which is no wonder the aristocracy kind of declined and collapsed and disintegrated. No wonder the civil war happened. The aristocrats had come to lead an extremely decadent life. And one of these manifestations is that the Elizabeth, don't talk please, there would be these long, processions right through the city of London, leading out of the city into the countryside. With Elizabeth, in due state inside a carriage, and there would be noblemen in front and noblemen at the back. There would be other aristocratic ladies in waiting. So that whole procession, imagine, it's like a military expedition, moving from one place to another, one country house to another. So aristocrats would actually go bankrupt trying to fund these visits. But you could not say no to the queen. And you also have to kind of register your loyalty, not just by offering her hospitality over months. The kind of situation we see in King Lear. Lear leading 100 people into Goneril's household, and then Goneril having to splitting her head over how she's going to manage it all. Uh, Likewise, we've talked about this. So this was routine matter in the Elizabethan age, right? Gift giving, it was a kind of politics of favor currying culture, culture of favoritism, which is crassly mercantile, which is crassly commercial, which is most importantly crassly materialist. So food, clothing saw a tremendous amount of, if you like, indulgence in fashion, a lot of new. This is almost kind of, a bit of work that I'm doing by way of sharing background information, background insights. It should help you in reading a lot of texts, for instance. So this whole idea of fashion was made possible by the fact that there was a lot of international trade with the Mediterranean and if you like, the Middle Eastern countries. So there are a lot of very lavish silk would come. Today's Syria, Damascus, Damascus silk would come from there. So there was Europe was kind of capitalizing on this spate of commerce and mercantile, and the kind of, if you like, the expansion of mercantile trade. And marbles would come from Italy, also from the other Mediterranean zone. Yes, please. Oh, Shumanto. Oh, I'm so sorry, Shumanto.
I'm sorry, I just
Yes, yes. No, I'm not.
যেতে হবে যেতে, হ্যাঁ যেতে হবে না, যে যাবে কেন, ওই রুমটার জন্য তো এসছি না। দেখো কি বলো, বিয়ের কার্ড দিচ্ছে মেবি, লাঞ্জনের জন্য বিয়ের কার্ড দিল। আগে নিমন্ত্রণ করছে ক্লাসের কাছে স্টুডেন্ট ভাবতেছি যাকে ফোন করে না ওরকম তো নাম না বলতে হবে কোনো কিছু এখানে প্রবলেম হলে শান্তি দাও শান্তি যে দরজা খুলে দেয় না না এখানে কোনো টেকনিক্যাল প্রবলেম হলে ম্যানেজারকে ডাকতে পারো না তাহলে এই হয়তো সেই আমি ওই জন্যই ভাবলাম হয়তো এখানে
Very sorry about this. বছর আমরা এখন অন্নপ্রাশনেও যাচ্ছি বিয়েতেও যাচ্ছি 21 years now. I'm very sorry about that. Yes, you can answer this. So, where was I? Yeah. So food, clothing, new kinds of fashion, new ways of wearing, or shall we say, new kinds of male and female fashion were in place. This was a time where a collective kind of celebration of materiality is happening, or materialism is happening, and consumerism. This is a side to the Renaissance we don't usually take into account, but this is very important. Next time round, or many of you have already probably read Volpone. Yes. So remember what is happening at the beginning of Volpone. What is he worshipping? A mound of gold. Gold is his son, right? And the whole point is that it's such an acquisitive culture. That people have no qualms about of kind of developing parasitical relationships with other human beings, simply in the interest of robbing them of their money and their material resources. So Volpone is the fox, the wily fox, who's only out for his own acquisitive, to satiate or gratify his own acquisitive impulse. And then he uses Mosca, as you know. Likewise with Corvino. Everyone, even women are used as property. Corvino's use of Syria and so on. So we are into that. So we are into a culture which has been made possible by if you like, the catalyzation of international trade, and this is what's going to ultimately lead to colonialism. Where is also the gold coming from? From South America. Mostly the Spanish kind of colonizers are getting the gold. You know, the English, they can be quite canny. The Spanish are doing the hard work, getting the gold out of South America, and the Spanish ships were in turn ambushed by the English ships, the privateers, the buccaneers. So they would in Bangla there's a term, "Chorer opore bat kara." That's exactly what the English were mostly doing. So and then the English were into that kind of nexus themselves. So you see, all this would fund colonialism, and also the colonialism would in turn also fund this classically commercialized acquisitive culture. That is what we are seeing. And the manifestation of that, of course, is also architecture. Right? People were building these lavish estates, which have to this day remained tourist hotspots in England. Chatham House, Woodstock, the Blenheim Palace would come a little later, but there are many such country houses, estate houses, which you'd be staggered to see what kind of shall we say art and expenditure is lavished upon the interiors. And this is here I'm concerned only with what may be seen as an English manifestation of that materialism. But a lot of this would be happening in that same century and successive centuries across Europe. Many of you know about Louis XIV, the Sun King, right? His Versailles was built on that kind of money, and to this day, I think it staggers us. Charlottenburg in Berlin, that is another place. So there are these. So all across Europe, we see the fruit of new money coming in. Right? So it is in that context that gardens and garden sculpturing and garden architecture takes on a very important aspect. What is it? So our question when we read this essay is, what is it that they can associate with the garden? Does he see it as an acquisitive place, as a place for sensuous, shall we say, gratification or self-indulgence, or does he see it as a space also perhaps of a different kind of affective, spiritual growth? This is a question that will preoccupy us. Because by the time we come round to Marvel, we see how Marvel is concerned more with the garden as a place of contemplation. Right? By biblically speaking, hortus conclusus is an idea associated with Virgin Mary, right? The garden is implicitly seen as a symbol of feminine purity, and also as a kind of trope or an allegory, a motif that stands for, epitomizes Virgin Mary and feminine purity. Anything to write on? No. Okay, so hortus conclusus, the term hortus, hortus, from which you have horticultural, right? So, and conclusus, confined, hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden, which is tantalizing, which is most inviting in a sensuous and sensual sort of way. So there's a desire component to it. Because it is enclosed, because you cannot see it entirely from outside, there's always an imagination of great wonders inside. So that is the big. So interestingly, this is and anything that stand up with the idea of feminine beauty or feminine, if you like, voluptuousness, is walking a tightrope when it comes to the tension between the body and the soul, between the sensual life and the spiritual life. And we see that tension, we will see that tension when we come round to Marvel's garden. We have to keep asking ourselves the question, why is Marvel in the garden at all? Why is he praising the garden? And you realize as the poem progresses that he is also a jilted lover. Somewhere he seems to be seeking in that garden the sensual delight that is now inaccessible to him, because his beloved has probably signed off from the relationship. So he writes, he imagines the garden as a place of refuge. But the garden also, as I said, is a place of purity because it is associated with the idea of Virgin Mary, somebody who's of unassailable virtue. So there's a mother figure and there's also the femme fatale, the seductress figure. They seem to come together in the idea of the garden. Garden is a place where flowers bloom. Garden is a place which is imagined to be, somewhere a kind of new version of the Garden of Eden, where eternal spring bloomed, where there was never decay. It's some place which kind of where time or the seasons have come to a standstill, where there is always everlasting bloom, everlasting greenery. So green, in terms of the greenness being a place or a site of youth, a youth that does not decay. So there are all these associations. So it's also a place of desire, desire either thwarted or deferred. Somebody who has not had their desires kind of satiated would go into the garden for alternative gratification. Gratification in the midst of the beauty surrounding them. And beyond that, of course, the trajectory would lead you to the garden as a place for contemplation. The vita contemplativa, as it's called. Nature. Nature, you go into nature, such as in Spencer, book 1, the life of contemplation. Not the life of sensual gratification, beyond that, life of contemplation. Even that can see the garden as a place, as a site of human attainment, of human self-realization. So there are all these layers to the construct of the garden. There's the idea of religious censure and religious, if you like, restriction or restraint on sensuality, because there's the association with Virgin Mary. There is the philosophical idea of the garden as a place of contemplation, but there is also the garden as a place that elevates you to towards the idea of the Creator. with its sheer wonder. The wonder leads you forth towards a contemplation of that which lies beyond the senses, God, the Creator. And so all these ramifications, all these dimensions are somewhere contained, and there's a lot of tension and frisson between these competing impulses, competing ramifications. But all of that is immanent in the idea of God. And somewhere the actual on the ground, the historical development of garden architecture. Notice my words, that is already quite telling. Garden architecture. So, garden is not a natural wilderness. Garden already comes with the connotation of being man made, artificial, an artifact, a space that is being remade, refabricated by human effort. It is also a profoundly urban concept because it is all about human intervention as opposed to the biblical idea of wilderness, which is untamed, which is primal, which is primitive, which is everything that the city is not. This is the worst classroom to have a class in. Very honestly, something about its acoustics. It catches the sound from practically all wings of the building. But so as I said, it's not my favorite classroom. But then we are stuck with it on days that there are examinations. Okay, so now let me then move to the next. I'm sorry, I'm taking my time to establish my concerns and the tenets of our discussion over the next few days. So, why is it that somebody like Bacon? Why are we concerned with Bacon in the context of gardens? And why is Bacon interested in gardens? Let's now get down to that. We have already we have established what is happening generally in that age. We have established the historical, social, cultural, and for that matter also economic context. Because without that there would not be the investment in garden architecture. Right? There's going to be a particular moment in the text when he says, when it comes to aristocrats, they don't just like their plants, they don't like these zones within this large sprawling garden. They will also make sure to include statues. They will also make sure to include marble artifacts. And he said, I don't like it. But what does that suggest? Such gardens, finely crafted, manicured gardens, where you have, such as we have for a while, sadly I never liked it, Prokriti Bhavan. That was the first of the beginning of the destruction of our Shonajuri and Ramcharai Rangamati Pot. It is no longer Rangamati Pot anymore. There used to be a house called Malunchal with a garden. Now we have a multi-storied building called Maluncho and the garden is gone. This whole idea of kind of human beings creating or fashioning architectural equivalents of or substitutes for copies of natural beauty, and then using these artifacts as to create to if you like to perpetuate a certain kind of nostalgic memory. So these are memory traces, as it were. You destroy nature and then you give names from nature to things that you create to destroy nature. Because that's the only way you can console yourself about or exorcise your guilt about not having that nature in it. Extraordinary what human beings do. So we have had Maluncho and we have had Maluncho apartments, and likewise we had Rangamati Pod and then you have Rangamati Lodge, but Rangamati Pod. So in Prokriti Bhavan, that was the first time, and it was clever. It was a very interesting Shantini touch to it, because somewhere it goes back to Rabindranath's idea about how art should be displayed or exhibited in a place like Shantiniketan. Just an organic space where nature and human artifacts can coexist, can cohabit. So you have the koi, and then suddenly out of that koi, suddenly you have a piece of sculpture that seems to come right out of the koi. Of course, it hasn't. It's profoundly, it's entirely made. But you have that concept in these little notes, and such artifacts strewn all over the place at Kola Bhavan, and then the new Kola Bhavan complex, which is right behind the Natya Ghar. You might go and see it there. So this whole Shantiniketan idea of making artifact sculpture part of the everyday community experience, ecological experience, ecologically, if you like, inflected architectural display or demonstration, which is very different from what we have in the concept of the museum, the colonial museum. This is what Rabindranath was trying to kind of revolt against. What is a museum? It's a building that cuts you off from the world outside. Right? It's a building, ironically, that takes the place of nature. And then it also, in a way, segregates the art objects, most of which are, of course, stolen when it comes to the British from Greece and from so many other. In fact, that also would have happened during the Iraq War, the Gulf War, probably. So what do? You relocate these art objects from their natural space, from their space of origin, and then you turn them into as you look after them. No doubt about it, they really know how to look after them. That's the only consolation, perhaps. But you are this is actually also to declare something an artifact that becomes an object of, if you like, one-sided viewing in a museum is also somewhere a declaration of its segregation from or severance of organic ties with the home culture or original culture. The moment you do that, you are actually also declaring that culture dead. Now the British Museum does it a little more differently. New ideas, anti-colonial ideas, post-colonial ideas have come in terms of how museology should be done. But what were the British? Why am I using all this? Think about Prakriti Bhavan. The whole idea of strategically combining the Hawaii landscape, which is already in many ways supposed to be create a certain kind of strange, alternative, alien artistic gratification. Because Hawaii is not to be seen anywhere else. Hawaii is exactly what earlier where people would come to Shantiniketan. Sadly, it is disappearing. Lalban, that is also disappearing thanks to real estate. We are all guilty of that. I too live in a multi-storied building. We are all guilty of that. The whole place must have been something like that. So we are all, but this is implication. It's not somebody else who does it. Somebody else does it for us. We come and buy a piece of property. We have to live here. We human beings do this to it. Right? So that was the idea that the British had also, in a way, in the original, if you like, manifestations of that garden impulse, that horticultural impulse, been about recreating classical Italy, classical Rome, in their newly acquired places. You see, land is the costliest possible thing you can have. People who were the Moorish in England of the 16th and 17th century, thanks to ready money, they had to convert it into something more, if you like, solid. So land would be what they would buy, and then there would be the desire to emulate past aristocratic cultures. That is how the sort of sculptured garden sculpture comes in, which is what I was comparing to Prakriti Bhavan. Right? So this is entirely as it were. That is why we can think about garden as part of, if you like, the architectural history of the Renaissance. Renaissance is also we cannot think about the Renaissance and the Reformation without taking into account wealth. Wealth. Why? In England, what do you think Henry VIII declared independence from the Catholic supremacy of the Catholic Pope? What was his ulterior motive? was money. It gave him the legal immunity and impunity to go about confiscating church land and to also co-opt, appropriate church wealth. So whatever initiation you have had into medieval culture, you know, you've read your Chaucer, the church used to collect what? Tithe. The church had accumulated a lot of wealth, a lot of wealth. And the repository of all these wealth, all such wealth were these establishments, ecclesiastical establishments, different churches, right? So what did Henry VIII do? He went after the churches. His ostensible reason was that he wanted a male heir. He wanted to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn so that he could have a son. Of course, that didn't happen with Anne Boleyn. So Anne Boleyn's head was cut off. Then came James Seymour, and thank goodness for Henry VIII. Although, of course, Edward the Sixth, of course, died a premature death. He died practically a minor. He was not able to deliver. So you know that history. But fundamentally, Henry VIII was also after the wealth of the church. So if it had not been for that confiscated wealth, the kind of lavish Renaissance, hedonism, consumerism, materialism that I am talking about would not have happened. It's a kind of rechannelization of church wealth towards the secular establishments of the aristocracy. Right? And then comes, of course, mercantilism, as a result of which both the aristocracy and the new mercantile gentry came into a lot of wealth. So what would they pump that wealth back into? Landed estates. This is the context for the kind of gardens we are talking about. And frankly, to go a little biographical, Bacon himself was also very, extraordinary man. He would, as you know, he would be indicted for taking a bribe. And for a very long time, he would be barred from coming anywhere near the court. So he was charged with corruption. So Bacon is a kind of person, he was a pragmatist in his own way, but his whole very philosophy of what is called essays, civil and moral, is a pragmatic philosophy that is not and cannot be identified with contemplative, esoteric self-denial. He's a person who believed in success, in material success, in court, in civic life. The whole thrust of the essays is towards that kind of success. Whom are these essays meant for? Suitors. Who are these suitors? Not just married suitors. Suitors for public office. So what is he teaching them? Why am I saying that he's a pragmatist? He's teaching them how to get by at court, how to land plum positions, how to ingratiate yourself with aristocrats, prospective patrons, even the monarch. Right? How to go about turning yourself into a Renaissance success story. So, in many ways, Bacon's essays are about the image makeover that we understand as Renaissance self-fashion. And I connected that to the fact that he had taken a bribe, whatever the temptation, whatever the pretext, he had taken a bribe. His philosophical texts actually come after he was banished from court. He is remembered today as a political scientist, as somebody who in many ways, if you like, creates the blueprint for how we look at nature. But the point is that even in those philosophical texts, he comes across as essentially the architect of the idea of colonialism. Why? Because he believes, and the text to read in this context is Novo Morgano. Right? The new instauration, the new instrument, Novo Morgano. What is the manifesto? You have to understand nature so that you can exploit nature. You don't understand nature in order to leave it alone. preserve it, conserve it, right? Not the idea of nature, of a sanctuary for nature, which today we are talking in terms. At the end, at the fag end of the Anthropocene. Because we know now that nature is already on the brink of destruction. So we have come full circle. But Bacon is to be located at the beginning of the Anthropocene. He is the one who is giving us the, if you like, the political and philosophical strategies for how nature can be harnessed. That is why he may be seen as the architect of colonial commerce. What is he saying? You go to nature, you understand nature, that is your science, that is your knowledge. When you learn directly from nature, you don't go to Aristotle and go back to his books and just understand nature in terms of what you've read in the books. That authoritarianism is passé. That deductive reasoning is passé. That's derivative knowledge. If you really want to use nature, harness nature, exploit nature, you have to learn directly from nature. Be it in the colonies, be it in America or in England. So go and understand nature directly. But understand with a view to being able to find out how to use its resources to the fullest. So this entire, if you like, conversion of nature from a mystical entity, such as we see in King Lear, which is to be worshipped, into an object, this objectification of nature, when nature is nothing but a resource, is largely because of Bacon. So that same impulse that I am connecting to why gardens are not just wilderness or nature. They are human nature. They are what we may understand as human artifact, human intervention in the physical environment. Garden is created by man. So in this essay may be seen therefore as a miniature manifesto of what Bacon is trying to argue. England and all these European colonizing nations, the ones with a desire to colonize, particularly England, ought to be doing if they are to make giant strides in science and technology, and a science and technology that would allow them to go to these other countries, colonize them, and bring that wealth back. Right, and I'm not giving you any novel kind of arcane new theory. If you read the first books in terms of, the history, the cultural history of ecology or eco-criticism as far as Europe is concerned, things, the arrow will point directly at Bacon. And I'm suggesting that Bacon's essay, Bacon's enthusiastic and almost, kind of is so, it's a celebratory essay in many ways. Is he celebrating? And it creates a certain kind of confusion. This is the question we have to negotiate. Is he celebrating nature? Because his whole essay is a kind of catalogue of this flower or that flower. This flower is colorful. That flower has a beautiful fragrance. Is he celebrating nature? No. He is. But this is a nature that's largely something that he thinks can be created, fashioned, manufactured by human effort. For him, this is science. Right? The harnessing of scientific knowledge for, if you like, exploiting nature, plumbing of its resources. That is technology. And what we see in Bacon's essay on garden is the technology of the making of a garden, the art of the making of a garden, the science of the making of a garden. Art is a word that had a very, very interesting kind of duality in the Renaissance. Art was used almost as a kind of substitute for the word science. Science in the sense in which the sciences, physical sciences, what was the word for that? Yes, natural philosophy. What was ethics? What was the name for ethics? Moral philosophy. Right? Science, what did science literally mean? To know. Knowledge. Right? And techne, of course, goes back to craftsmanship, the idea from all the way back to Plato and Greek. Right? So he believed that this knowledge of nature, the kind of knowledge about flowers and herbs and trees and shrubs, the whole spectrum, horticultural, botanical spectrum that he's sharing. He's sharing that so that this can also be a manual for how gardens can be constructed. So, contrary to leaving nature unattended, untended, this is about garden is the classic, if you like, a context for seeing how nature has Bacon and his contemporary saw it was largely a matter of domesticating nature, right? And domestication, philosophically, morally, conceptually, or taming is always about exploitation, harnessing some other kind of power by using a dominating hegemonic uh, energy to subjugate it. So that is also what makes it so masculinist. So Bacon is the kind of philosopher. If we gender it, I said earlier in this class how garden is essentially always culturally, anthropologically seen as a feminine space. If it is untended nature, that would always implicitly be seen as matter, as primal matter. And also, somewhere there could be a kind of anthropological equation with the feminine principle. But Renaissance architecture, and Bacon also subscribes to that. This would be true of, for instance, fortification, forts. Medieval forts were circular, were a lot more permeable. The Renaissance forts are like staggering scientific they're an architectural marvel. They require the kind of math I was talking about. Extremely intricate. One of the great artists come architectural designers when it comes to military fortification is the great German painter Albrecht Dürer. He's an artist, but he was also a designer of fortresses. And this Renaissance idea of fortress, fortification, impermeable, unattainable, unassailable, nobody can come outside. They were not circular, they didn't have that femininity of design to them. They were jagged, they were geometrical, they were emphatically seen as the product of human knowledge. Likewise with gardens. When we come round to reading the text, we see how he wants to divide up the space in terms of what will grow well where. So there's beautification, but there's also a functionality to why he wants to plant certain kinds of trees or shrubs or flowering plants somewhere. Where he wants to create pathways. Because see, the whole idea is that it's not just built, it's a place separated from human trespass, because it's once it is made, there will be no need for human intervention. No. He's constantly talking about where a kind of podium might be created or a pavilion for watching the garden, how pathways ought to be created so that we can go in and come out. In other words, this is a place that always will have to require and it will solicit human intervention. People will come in either to tend the garden or to enjoy it. Human control, human domination. So insofar as imperialism is also a masculinist ethos, Bacon's essay, Bacon's idea of the garden is also a masculinist ethos of domination imposed upon the raw, untended matter, feminine, quasi-feminine matter of nature. The nature that we have encountered in King Lear. So this text is going to is gesturing forward towards Marvel, but it's also gesturing back towards what we have read in King Lear. It offers an interesting contrast with the primitive, femininized nature that is unknown, primal, aboriginal nature that we encounter in King Lear through King Lear's eyes, the mother. That mother is going to become Virgin Mary in Christian thought. The tamed mother, the mother of the God the Son. But there's also the anxiety to keep that mother tamed, contained, protected. That is the idea of the hortus conclusus, enclosed garden. But there's always a pathological fear, anxiety that the woman will stray, that the woman cannot be contained. So this strange kind of, not, I wouldn't say misogynistic poetics, but poetics of fear around the female, the feminine, operative through most masculine writing, male writing in the Renaissance, which is, and I'm suggesting that in Bacon's very essay, remember Bacon's contemporary Walter Raleigh, what did he say in another classic proto-colonial text? What did he say about America is the land, the virgin land? He says that's the land that's lying fallow. You go and conquer it. You go and ravish it. He even used the word rape. Land is to be raped by the colonialist. He's urging his fellow compatriots, come in, it's a land that's lying for you to conquer. So that very strongly sexual rhetoric, that these are the beginnings of colonialism. And what I'm suggesting is that without any kind of prejudice, that it was inherently masculinist in nature. And it's founded upon this contrast between the hegemonic kind of hierarchy between the mind and the matter. The mind is always masculine, matter is always feminine. Right? So this is our context for reading Bacon. We have a little bit of time, don't we, till 1:30. Can you tolerate me till then? Right. So because we ought to be at least making some headway. Right. Any questions so far? Anything that you have not understood? Any background information you need on Bacon?
How was nature associated with the seductive figure?
Because of the very fact that it is somewhere there's a tacit acknowledgement that nature is beautiful. So there's a desire, the architectural impulse that I'm talking about, through its different movements or directions, I think may be seen as an effort to replicate that essential beauty in nature. Think about, even for that matter, the text, all too well-known text, Philip Sidney's Arcadia. The competitive Renaissance impulse that we see there is that nature is, whatever it is, brazen. The effort should be to recreate nature, but in the process of recreating, you're also bettering it. Nature is golden. The world that is created by the poet is golden. Right? So, the two impulses that come together in response to, if you like, what nature presents as a threat is both to tame it and to replicate it. You tame it by replicating it. The moment you can replicate it, you're also rendering it defunct, superfluous, because you've already been able to create something better. I would see that as precisely what this is, a civilizational impulse. Right? Ironically, why am I saying there's a tension there? If you go back to the Bible, particularly the 16th century, the kind of the Bible texts that we read today mostly are 1611 authorized Bible, for instance. There's also, at the same time, been very Freudian, constant reminder to the same urban man that your pride seems to make you think that you can keep on building on nature. You can decimate nature and, and substitute that with great heights. The whole idea of the city as a built-up place. But remember, this impulse itself will then come to a head when your sinfulness, a very sinful presumption of having kind of challenged nature, the very nature that God had put in place in the first place. This post-lapsarian desire to challenge God or resist God, this will meet with God's wrath. And cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, cities will be decimated. And then those cities will be raised, pulled down, and then supplanted with nature. What nature? Wilderness. So what the punitive kind of the cycle is that you human beings, you are being too presumptuous in trying to supplant wilderness with city. But someday that process will also come full circle, where cities will also be decimated, razed to the ground, and then turned back to wilderness. That will be punishment. So that the cyclicality of of human fortuna, like human effort, attainment, and failure, is kind of pinned to a moral retributive framework. But if you do too much, if you defy God, you resist God, right? You become self-sufficient, but you don't remember God anymore, then you'll be back in the very nature that you build out of. Right? So we have a tension between this technological civilization impulse towards progress and the religious impulse which is trying to keep human beings warm. You're going too far. You're presumptuous. You are defying faith. So these two, I mean, it's that tug of war that we ought to kind of is why that misogyny. So, and what do you then? And, but I don't think it's an early modern invention in terms of seeing nature in man, in woman, or woman in nature. I think it goes that ecofeminists would tell you it's something more fundamental, something more primal and anthropological. It would probably have been derived from earlier, more pagan sources, which had remained the kind of uh, or which had kind of collected or accumulated in the collective unconscious of your European memory. So the early modern period sees the crystallization of all these anxieties. It wants progress. It is pro-mercantilist. It is consumerist. It needs resources. It is colonialist. It is also profoundly misogynistic. So all these ideas, and we see that anxiety being played out in King Lear, for instance. The fear of the mother, the love of the mother. Yes.
You said about the inclusive of Virgin Mary, inclusive, why it is to be inclusive?
No, I didn't say there was any logic to it. Implicitly, somewhere in theological ideas, because you see, Virgin Mary is seen as the point now that you ask me. Virgin Mary comes to, just as Christ was imagined as somebody who came to correct Adam's flaw. Virgin Mary is also seen as somebody who corrects the flaw of Eve. Yes, 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 yes. You understand? So it's the contained woman. The woman, but if you look back to, and it's a Catholic idea, by the way. It's a Catholic idea because Virgin Mary is not at all important in Protestant post-Reformation Christian theology. Here, all in all, is God, Christ, and Christ's Father, God the Father, and God the Son. No talk about Virgin Mary. But Virgin Mary, the very equation of Virgin Mary with the idea of the contained woman, the woman who's safe, the woman who's protected, the woman who's also protective because she doesn't leave her designated place or space. She's the good mother. She's the good woman. As opposed to Eve, who had strayed. Eve, who had gone another place, another spot in the Garden of Eden, and who had allowed herself to be tempted. So it is through the association with Eve that Virgin Mary also gets associated with the idea of goddess. Protected but vulnerable. Beautiful but vulnerable. Vulnerability in beauty, beauty and vulnerable. That is also beautiful, therefore vulnerable. Therefore requiring protection. This is a fascinating paradox. And remember, cities always had walls. So the city could also be seen as a garden, as a paradise, a constructed paradise. Any other questions? Sorry, I've kind of bombarded a lot of ideas, but I wanted to do that because you don't have, earmarked word background classes, but you need that kind of background. So yeah. So anything, basic things about Bacon's essays, in case some of you have not done it before. What is Bacon? What about the essay form? Whom is it owed to? Michel de Montaigne, yes, in the 1570s. Was Michel Montaigne's essays? By the way, Bacon visited France. Bacon was in France for a while. Did the Montaigne's essays directly kind of come to and influence late Elizabethan, early Jacobean writers? No. Who brought them? An Italian refugee called John Florio, who did elaborate translations of Michel de Montaigne's essays. John Florio is the reason why essays happened in England. But Montaigne's essays are very different. They are, dialectical exercises. They are freewheeling. They are, by the way, you know that essay means to try. So essay as a form is a tentative prose form, right? And it had overlaps with two other forms: character books, books of characters. One, a famous writer who is associated with that form is Sir Thomas Overbury. Essay. Essay and books of characters. What were books of characters? Something that you see, for instance, in the Kavali papers, right? Typical, stereotypical character who's a type, of a social type or an economic type. And you have a very close, intricate social historical description around that book of character. And you see in that character many individuals whom you would see in society. So these are books of character. So there's a faint overlap with books of characters in that these forms or these texts were also short. But Bacon's essays have nothing to do with that. Bacon was not imitating Michel de Montaigne at all. He wanted to do something that I said a little while ago. He wanted to write short essayistic prose, which are essentially advice manuals. Another moment when I would have been very happy to use the board. There is this Renaissance form of writing going back to early humanists, ars dictaminis, ARS small letters, and a separate word DICTAMANIS, ars dictaminis, roughly translated in political theory or humanist history as advice manuals. Advice manuals. Essentially, Bacon is trying to write advice manuals in a new form. Not long tracts and treatises, but short essays. He's writing them in English, whereas his more scientific, philosophical works are in Latin. So why is he writing them? These are pragmatic texts of advice to people like him, contemporaries, educated gentry, humanist scholars who want to make it in the Renaissance court, in Renaissance society, right? The suitors that I'm talking about, and how do you make out that is actually fundamentally the purpose or objective? What are they called? Essays, civil and moral. And the fundamental idea upon which this combination of civil and moral rests is that you have to have a bit of morality in order to find success. So he's trying to marry pragmatism and morality, the ethical and the political. To find success, what had Machiavelli said, all you need to do is pretend, you know. But Bacon is a little more pragmatic than that. No, no mere pretension won't do. One of the classic, truisms that are associated with Bacon is honesty is the best policy. Honesty is a good policy. So he doesn't say pretension is the best policy. Machiavelli would have said that. But he says no, honesty is the best policy. It's a good policy to be honest. So that's a Baconian balance. You have to strike a balance between being pragmatic, between serving self-interest, and also being ethical, truthful, and so on. This is the classic Baconian balance. And that is the balance that he's embodying in these various essays, most of which are written as I said, texts, short, economical texts and advice to younger contemporaries, people who would have been in his shoes, for instance. He was an extremely ambitious man. He went on to become Lord, like Thomas More, remember, although almost exactly a century after Thomas More. He went on to become Lord Chancellor, Lord Protector. Before the fall came, he took a bribe and was out of court. So he knew he knew what he had in mind. He knew what he was talking about. This is a kind of blueprint for public success, personal success at court. Right? Now, as to the form, it's not just enough, it doesn't suffice to say that this is the essay, these were tentative. One of the things why the essay term fits Bacon's essays is because he took them through multiple versions. So maybe the first version was very, very short. And then he would add a little more to that in the subsequent edition. And maybe a little more. So some became quite long. In fact, the one we are going to be reading, not of beauty, that's a short one, of gardens, is a longish one. And in many ways it's uncharacteristic. Ostensibly, whatever does gardens have to do with public success? But no, the very fact that public success requires a kind of discipline that gardening also requires. That would be the connection. Right? So in terms of form, tentative because he is revising them as he goes. They are short, they are very brief, then they go on to become slightly longer. He brings in tensions, new dynamics, he makes them a little more elaborate. That's another thing to find out if you're later on interested, what kind of topics get the most amount of words from him. Right. Sorry, I'll shut that down. Just 5 more minutes and I'll finish for the day. I'm going to get my phone. Sorry. Right. Finally, so that is one bit about and the style. That's the last background information I'm going to give with, which is what kind of prose is he writing?
Aphoristic style.
The aphoristic style.
Aphoristic,
Yes.
sorry, I'm sorry.
Anaphora is different. Aphorisms, proverbs, right? Short, pithy, epigrammatic sayings. Epigram is a classical form. Very brief proverb or an adage. So his writing is also epigrammatic, brief, economical. But in terms of its antecedents, it's the Attic or the Senecan style, as opposed to the early humanists who had used the Ciceronean style, which was very elaborate, long sentences. So a sentence would I'm going to imagine and I'm writing on the board. So the sentence would start there and would go cover 10 lines and stop here. Onek অসমাপিকা ক্রিয়া. Okay. So very long-winded. That's a Ciceronian style. Whereas he steers away from that style. That is also the reason why he may be seen as the architect of Enlightenment prose, forefather of Enlightenment prose. So we are talking about the essay form which is tentative, but this new tentative essay form in Bacon's hands becomes a harbinger for scientific language, very economical language, the kind of language that Hobbes praises in Leviathan. So what is he trying to do? He's trying to pare down language to a form, compress it to a form that will render it suitable for scientific writing. So Bacon's contributions to science, the English Enlightenment, are enormous. Because usually the other kind of imaginative writing, something that we see as far as Milton is extraordinarily intellectual. But if you look at his prose, it is extremely clumsy. Almost a century ago, Bacon is writing English, but it's so terse, so chiseled, so economical. That is also the reason why we are reading essays. Sorry about this. I'll stop there. Tomorrow, no, not tomorrow. Monday, 10:30. I'll do of gardens. All right. Anybody I have not marked?
Thank you.
অনন্যাদি 15th জানুয়ারি। অনন্যাদি 15th জানুয়ারি।
Because ideally you would want to look. I'm sorry, I'm being a little flippant, but what I mean is that if you want to you would want to research something that you are interested in. So, but for the এটা পুরো একেবারে পলিটিক্যাল থিওরিতে চলে যাওয়া হলো, সেই ফ্রি উইল অ্যান্ড সো অন। ব্যাপারটা হচ্ছে সবাই তো একেবারে ফার্স্ট প্রেফারেন্স পাবে না, তাই না? তাহলে আবার সব কটা টপিক রিপ্রেজেন্টেড হচ্ছে। তাহলে আর সাথে আরেকটা ডেঞ্জার থাকে, সেটা হচ্ছে যে মোটামুটি তারা যারা ওই কয়েকটা মাত্র মুসলিমের কয়েকটা টপিক সকলে একই সঙ্গে আলোচনা করে লিখলো, মোটামুটি সব একরকম, সেটারও একটা সম্ভাবনা থাকে। এই দুটোকেই আমি ফোরস্টল করার চেষ্টা করছি, বাদ রাখার চেষ্টা করছি। তার মানে কি এবার তাহলে হয় যে ফার্স্ট প্রেফারেন্স সব পাবো না, কেউ কেউ সেকেন্ড প্রেফারেন্স পাবে, কেউ কেউ হয়তো ফার্স্ট প্রেফারেন্স পেয়েও যেতে পারে, কেউ কেউ অন্তত থার্ড প্রেফারেন্সটা পাবে। You understand? And সেইটা এবার তোমাদের work out the logistics, how you're going to go about it. But as I said, I mean, if it's going to be about drawing lots, each piece of paper should have two references from each person, right? So দেখা যাবে যে ধরো তুমি সংখ্যায় এই যে এতগুলো ফার্স্ট টপিকটাকে এতগুলো দেওয়া যাচ্ছে, এবার তারপরে তার মানে প্রথম যে 5 জন লট ড্র করলো তাদের হয়তো তাদের ফার্স্ট প্রেফারেন্সটা এক্সস্টেড হয়ে গেল, তারপরে যারা আসবে তারা হয়তো সেকেন্ড প্রেফারেন্সটা চলবে, এইভাবে ব্যাপারটা হতে পারে। এখন এই যে নাম ডাকা, अगेन ব্যাক টু পলিটিক্যাল থিওরি, নাম ডাকা সেটা কি র্যান্ডম হবে না অ্যালফাবেটিক্যাল অর্ডার হবে, এছাড়া আর কোনো ফেয়ার সিস্টেম নেই। এক হচ্ছে যে আমার নাম যা কিছু করার নেই সেটা হতে পারে, বা লটারি হতে পারে। আর কোনো সিস্টেম হলে সেটা আনফেয়ার হয়ে যাবে। আর কোনো প্রেফারেন্স হলে যে আমি সামনের বেঞ্চে বসে আছি আর কেউ লাস্ট বেঞ্চে বসে আছে, সামনের বেঞ্চ আগে আগে তাড়াতাড়ি তুলে নিতে পারলো, that will be unfair. So this is also about, you know, ethical management. So I'm placing a project before you. It's also about how you go about it rather than simply just finding a topic to write out a project on. The selection process is also important. তোমরা তারপরে পিএইচডি করতে যাবে, দেখবে আজকাল যেভাবে পিএইচডি করে সেটাতে হচ্ছে যে কিছু কিছু প্রেফার্ড এরিয়াস দেওয়া থাকে, তোমরা এক্স্যাক্টলি যদি সেটা নিয়ে কাজ করতে চাও বেশ কিছুটা অপেক্ষা করতে হতে পারে। আবার এমনটাও হচ্ছে যে কিন্তু অপেক্ষা করা যায় না, কারণ চাকরি পেতে গেলে পিএইচডি করতে হবে, পরে তাই তার একটা পিএইচডি ছাড়া পড়াশোনা একাডেমিক চাকরি পাওয়া যাবে, তখন কি করতে হবে? আচ্ছা আমি এইরকম ভেবেছি, I'm sorry, I'm speaking in Bangla, but there is Pura. Uh, uh, I just maybe that just shows I was. So suppose I were I'm presented with the prospect of perhaps trying my luck at a university or a department which presents me with, let's say, a very finite number of possible images. Amazing. Possible images in একটু আগে the high speed motorbike গেল. To imagine that this is a university, or maybe a finite number, say 5 possible areas. Now I have to match my preferred topic to it. That is exactly the kind of exercise I'm asking you to get used to, which means you have to steer your interest just a little towards something that will come kind of more or less match or might place you in a position of advantage vis-a-vis a prospective supervisor, but will not entirely compromise your area of interest altogether. So this is the kind of balancing act I'm asking you to do. It's good to do that, good to try around it. So, which means that you want to work on the Renaissance, you want to get a sense of the Renaissance, and I'm suggesting these topics also because it will help you prepare for the background question in your examination. So there's a pragmatic, there's a, if you like, there's a utilitarian angle to this also, which is that it will help you read a little beyond just the text and what we understand as critical material. It will encourage you to read other things which will open up the Renaissance as a historical period for you, history of ideas, and so on. And therefore, in doing so, you will not just be in a better position to answer that first question, you will also be able to use the extra knowledge that you acquire in course of your research, because that will all feed into the answers that you write. You know, every one of these answers will require at the master's level a degree of engagement with the literature, and the cultural history of the Renaissance, particularly Renaissance in England as a whole. It will not just be about England. We will encourage you to bring in cross-referentially some other text or some historical uh, phenomenon. How are you going to acquire that, given that this is a semester system? How are you going to, because we are not kind of earmarking a lot of classes for background. We want to do that. After the 10th of February, I will probably have to continue taking classes once in a while. If I, of course, very regularly, if I'm not done with the syllabus by then, I will be taking classes online because I'll go on leave because my son is going to be taking his exams began today, his second public examination. So I will keep talking about the background as well. But this is your way of initiating yourself into independent scholarship. So, three possible preferences, at least you get to choose one. That way you work on something that might interest you, doesn't interest you strongly, which why not? Well, Google form it, why not? Strongly disagree, agree. It's like somewhere, it's like a poll. So it's a poll, it's a vote. Strongly disagree, they can strongly agree. That much can I It is about, it's about that. So I think I've spent a way, not quite very much, a lot of time. But I hope you now know why I don't want the method that you suggested. But if you still want it, you can go about it. Then, after the lots are drawn, whatever is left over will have to be taken by the remainder. It is not fair. So if you want lottery, if you want to go by luck, good luck to you. Okay. So this itself deserves discussion. I hope we come down to doing that when we read Thoreau together. Because Thoreau is fascinating in this context. So the idea about where to draw a line between personal will and the collective interest. I think this has been the most important political debate in Western history since the time of Aristotle. the idea of the greatest good. The whole idea of politics is founded upon this very interesting adjustment, if at all it's an adjustment, between your private preference, your personal good, and the collective. So personal good would be everyone gets to choose their preferred topic, full stop. But what if not? I hear sighs, I wish I could sigh too, but it's just that this was not a digression I wanted. Alright, so onto the text. Can you refresh my memory as to which page the text begins at? Page number 174. Thank you very much. So you get one of the reasons why this is a very good edition, very good college edition as it were, or university edition, is that it gives you all the background material. So we were talking in general about the significance of the trope or the idea of the garden. And now let's get down to what Bacon has to say, and let us therefore use that as a platform to get back into the discourse. So the point to note is the point to note is that garden is ultimately an artificial, built-up nature. So God Almighty first planted a garden, and indeed it is the purest of human pleasures. It is the greatest refreshment to the spirits of man, without which buildings and palaces are but gross handiworks. In other words, human built-up buildings are incomplete without the surrounding gardens. The surrounding gardens, by as it were, add to, are incremental to the aesthetics of architecture. Uh, Something that I've already talked about in terms of the actual practice in Renaissance England, in 17th century England, and ideas that would probably also have to some extent come from the Middle East, partly at least, right, and so on. So it is the hanging garden of Babylon. I just remembered that. So, yes, please.
It was one of the 7 wonders
Of the world. Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. But Nebuchadnezzar, of course, is the anathema, is the alien, foreign king, the aggressor, uh, who was defeated, as you know, by deputy, as it were, by Judith of Holofernes, and Judith when she beheaded Holofernes. That's also biblical apocrypha. It is the greatest refreshment to the spirits of man, without which buildings and palaces are but gross handiworks. And a man shall ever see that. Notice the emphasis on man. Somewhere what we see here is the immanence and the persistence of the Vitruvian idea of man. So it doesn't take you to delve too deep into the text. We are already a few lines, a few sentences into the text. We're already introduced to a kind of overwhelmingly masculine gaze, with the focus being on man. A man shall ever see that when ages grow to civility and elegancy, men come to build stately sooner than to garden finely, as if gardening were the greatest perfection. I do hold it in the royal ordering of gardens. There ought to be gardens for all the months in the year. So that is where his precepts begin. The first thing is a premise. So far it's been the premise. Premise is what? There's no questioning the importance of gardens, aesthetically speaking. And also, remember, I've made this point about Bacon. Bacon follows the Ciceronian balance between utilitas and honestas, which means something has value in itself, but that value is also in part, in addition, a utilitarian value. So everything has an intrinsic value and an use value. So gardens are beautiful, but in this essay, is he interested in gardens for their own sake? No. Gaze is entirely, as it were, anthropocentric. So you might want to do a kind of eco-critical critique of this essay. Gardens for him exist to pleasure the human gaze. Right? to please, to offer aesthetic comfort, distraction, entertainment to the human gaze, to man's gaze, right? So nature again already. That's the reason why I wanted you to see this as a quintessentially draconian text in a certain understanding of nature or as something serviceable, as a resource. So even when nature is not being, physically, as it were, ravaged, physically plundered, the kind of concepts that come around in let's say, Novo Moderno. Even when nature is just being gazed at, ultimately it is about human interest. This is not so this is an interesting illusion that aestheticism can create, which is that aestheticism is disinterested. You are going to come around to such a position, for instance, when we read Walter Pater's conclusion to the Renaissance. He makes it sound like, oh, nothing so pure. In fact, that's a word that Pater uses. Nothing quite as pure as the pleasure offered by God. So what is pure? Politically speaking, this is not pure. This is about, as it were, gratifying human sensual interest. Right? It's overwhelmingly about human pleasure. This has to be acknowledged. Flowers bloom, we write poetry about flowers, right? Well, do flowers bloom because they want to please us humans? Probably not. They want to please. Yes, there is there's a stake in looking beautiful and attractive, which is a biological imperative, which is that the pollens will be carried over, dispersed by the visiting bees. So there's an ecosystem working in the aesthetics, right? But we seem to, human beings, carve out for ourselves a vantage point which is ostensibly disinterested. We are not part of that kind of reproductive cycle, so our interest in the flowers is pure. The word disinterested, which means, there's no stake, there's no utility. But we don't understand or acknowledge that aesthetics itself is the biggest utility. So we can also critique, we can challenge the idea that pleasure, which is or enjoyment, is necessarily a pure action or function. Purism is not something we can associate. So that immediately breeds the question: what exactly is he trying to contrast this from? What is then an impure pleasure? Right? So there are then impure pleasures. What would that be? Gluttony, food, right? Certain kind of food. Just because we are not consuming the flower, it's not entering our body system, biological system, does that make it automatically pure? So this idea of purity itself has to be challenged, right? So bottom line is, this is all about humans. It's about taming nature, domesticating nature, harnessing nature towards one or another kind of human interest. So he has established that. And of course, as always, as somebody who is writing in that period, it is always useful, it is safe, it is judicious to begin with God. And so immediately we are taken back to the example of the Garden of Eden. So if God had wanted a garden to be in place, and if God had located his highest creation, the ultimate creation, which is man, in such a garden, then of course that is seen as a validation of wanting to expend energy, resources on making gardens, not just buildings. Right? As I had said the other day, Sharon, I think this too is somewhere a kind of effort to approximate to the idea of pristine, unexploited, untarnished, prelapsarian nature. So somewhere the approximation is that when we there's that the desire is to go back to the Garden of Eden. The idea of approximation is to that. But this is a compensating effort. But then this always kind of has to be held in, it walks a tightrope with the simultaneous impulse, which is to better nature. So the idea is, well, there was the Garden of Eden. Now, implicitly, of course, there would be an effort to better this, excel this. So I think humanity, in terms of this competitive impulse, the technological impulse, humanity is always walking in this tightrope. Western man in particular, the whole drive towards technology, for that matter. Think of an Apple product, for instance. The whole, this extraordinary thing about creating beauty, which is also extremely functional, right? Trying to adjust these two principles of perfect beauty. So that this desire or the longing or the nostalgia for a perfect language, perfect beauty, right? Perfect aesthetics is something very quintessentially Western about it. And it's a burden of the biblical idea of the Garden of Eden, a pre-lapsarian state, which of course, as you know, borrows from the classical idea of the Golden Age, right? So since the Golden Age, we have had Bronze Age, Iron Age. So technologically, we have advanced. But the more advanced we have, the more we have advanced, or the world has, following in the footsteps of the West, the more the West has been pining for the lost Golden Age. This is also the idea that, to some extent, Raymond Williams offers us in The Country and the City. It is the more we have moved towards the Industrial Revolution and embracing its legacy, the more have we also continued to, as it were, magnify the the fantasy of a nature, a pristine nature. So the fantasy grows in direct proportion to how far you're being moving away from the imagined reality, left behind reality of a pristine garden. Think about it. If the Garden of Eden had sufficed, would Adam and Eve have left it? And that's the point Milton makes. It's a Phoenix Pulpa, it's a happy fall. Because there had been this, what again, tree of knowledge. Think about the Promethean myth. It's about God having access to something that humanity badly wanted. Whether they needed it is a different question, they certainly wanted it. And that kind of led to the departure, metaphorical uh, and literal, from the Garden of Eden. But the fantasy of Garden of Eden is essentially a post-lapsarian. So he begins with God, but that is not just the stepping stone. I do hold it. In the royal ordering of gardens, there ought to be gardens for all the months in the year. So this is written, as you can see from the head note, this is squarely in the Jacobean era. In fact, at the fag end of the Jacobean era. By that time, as I said, post-Reformation architecture, Christopher Wren had made his presence felt. So we are into, and also Charles I had been very much into this aesthetic rebuilding or redecoration of London. So this is Bacon intervening in that discourse, trying to make a point. So the I is very significant. Right? He's trying to have a say on what country houses, or for that matter, London gardens should look like. In fact, I invite you to, if you want to, interested, you might want to look up the great all the wonderful gardens and parks in London, or literally speaking, the Covent Garden, where these were all essentially, they came out from the 17th century onwards. So Hyde Park, Kew Gardens, Kensington Park, extraordinary parks there. So this idea of London, the bigger it is growing as a metropolis, again, the more it is trying to compensate for the loss of the countryside by recreating an artificial countryside within its own spaces. Right? So so this kind of is endorsed by the Raymond Williams thesis about countryside being a myth somewhere, concept, an idea, rather than a reality. The reality is Wordsworth's Michael, where the father is sitting all alone, devastated by a heap of broken stones. That's all that's left of the arable land. The son has gone away for work to the city. So the father stands abandoned. The farmer, the shepherd, have nothing to do. They are dispossessed. That is the reality. Successive enclosure movements, that is what it had created. But the fantasies of a countryside. Right? So the eye is important. So there should be what he says, garden for all the months of the year, in which severally things of beauty may be then in season. So it's a very ambitious blueprint. And in many ways, this is used, whatever he may be writing about, this is important. It is Bacon. This is a Baconian kind of blueprint for how to go about. And there's always going to be, for instance, why am I saying this? If you read this 1605 work, if I'm right about the date, Advancement of Learning, it is a staggeringly ambitious treatise which addresses King James I and which kind of underlines what has since become the knowledge power kind of nexus. What does it say? Well, these are the different subjects that should be taught. This is how education, pedagogy should be disciplined. These are all so, and all of these can only be done if the state takes charge of education. And it's such an ambitious technique, there's no subject that it doesn't cover. And that interesting, these are Bacon too. You must understand he was also in many ways the quintessential Renaissance man. He was the architect of the recodification, simplification of law in James I school. He was the one who was also, he contributed hugely to the legal minutiae of the unification between Scotland and England. So he was a very good administrator, he was a very good jurist, legal theoretician, right? So he was not just a scientist. So his science to him meant a way of thinking, a certain kind of discipline, an academic discipline or academic methodology, which he applied to different disciplines. So just as in the advancement of learning, he was talking about the entire spread, the spectrum of subjects. And he was also trying to create a hierarchy of them. Likewise in this essay, about which class should go where, so it's the same kind of comprehensive, encompassing approach. This is not a personal essay in the sense that he talks about his preference for one kind of flowers over another. It's not about me trying to say I like tulips and I want a garden only full of tulips. That's not it. That's not the kind of essay this is. You would expect that from Monte. Reflective, very, very kind of slow essays which take you deep into the mind of and the being and the everyday life, the everyday practices of a man for its own sake. That's very modern. For Bacon, no, this is a project. Garden is also a project, a public project. He speaks, deliberates as a, if you like, he's offering public, what we may understand as public opinion. This is for public consumption. That is why it has its place in amongst these essays, which are essays civil and moral. How gardens should be designed is also for him a civil concern. So by December and January, the latter part of November, you must take such things as are green all winter. He gives a whole kind of catalogue. And this catalogue tradition will be used a lot in fact, it's both overlaps with and contrasts with pastoral elegies, pastoral literature, where you would have allegorized lists or catalogues of botanical detail, herbariums. Think about Lycidas. Many of you have read Lycidas. So you have a specific kind of plants mentioned, specific kinds of blooms which are evocative of mourning, lament, death, and for that matter, maybe it have been traditionally associated seasonally with winter, things like that. So, the plant catalog is a stock idea. But in Bacon, he's taking charge of that. He's taking control of that. He decides what plant catalog. It's not something that he has received traditionally from earlier literature. He's not regurgitating. He's not repeating received ideas about what plant is good and what not. This is I. This is what I want. I come from a fresh vantage point, a scientific vantage point, because I'm trying to also, in trying to recreate the Garden of Eden, that's how he seems to be thinking aloud. I'm trying to create the garden as a space that can rival the Garden of Eden, because something or the other will be blooming all the time. So, by default, this will also be an eternal garden. But he believes that this garden can be created, fabricated, constructed. It is not the Garden of Eden created by God, but it will get pretty close to that. That's the aspiration. So, what does he say? Severally things of beauty may be there in season, but December and January and so on. Sorry, yeah, lavender, periwinkle, there's a whole lot of, and notice the compression, style-wise, stylistically speaking. Lots of commas, lots of names one after another. So there's an effort, as it were, to compress as it were, call it? Yeah, compress perhaps. A very vast spectrum into very economically into the small space of an essay. An essay that covers the ground almost metonymically, a whole garden would. So the essay as a form to talk about the garden, this kind of garden is also ambitious. Then follow it for the latter part of January. So first December and January. As you know, you all know about the shepherd's calendar, right? So the idea of yes.
এখানে লাইন নাম্বার 89 metals if they stove
Stoved, say to it in energy, stove to stove, burned, scorched, toasted, set in a hot house, stoved in the sense of a glass house.
MYRTLES pronunciation here
Myrtle.
Martin কি জিনিসটা
It's also a kind of flower, plant, shrub. All of these are plants. All of them. Bay, juniper, cypress trees.
নামটা আগে শুনে নিতে হবে
আচ্ছা।
আবার বলছি স্টোভ করতে হবে
Stove in the sense of growing them like orchids are grown in Darjeeling, I believe. Specially created glass houses, nurseries, in temperature control. So there follow it, gardening has been a very, very active culture. It is a culture in England. Something interestingly that Shantiniketan has. Most householders have a garden, a kitchen garden at the back and a flower garden in front, and a lot of intellectual, affective energy, physical energy, of course, is expended and fascinating. But there is something of the idea of the English leisure. It's a very European elitist idea, which must have been brought over by people, who have been frequenting abroad. So the original astronomics had a lot of traffic with the West. So to this day, and there are programs on radio, BBC radio, on BBC television, dedicated to gardens, and the hosts have been at it for years and years, for decades. They have been experts, right? So Bacon is not a one. I mean, what I mean is that Bacon is not being arcade talking about gardens. He's catering to what he saw perhaps as a rising interest in a certain leisured class. Right? In a class that had come into a certain kind of money, a class that now had perhaps maybe the mercantile gentry, maybe the educated, maybe the aristocrats, all of them. There followed from, yeah, for the latter part of January, the mesorean tree and so on, which blossoms. So you get technical details about why he wants them there. So that scientific approach, he's also offering rationale for why something should be planted when. Right? So it's prescriptive, but it is also explanatory, explicative. He wants it to something somewhere to a kind of manual. The early tulipa, hyacinthus, and then you have a long list again. Then comes March. So I was going to tell you the whole idea about kind of the calendrical commemoration or celebration of seasons also is very much a uh, literary practice, because you have shepherd's calendar, which is, as you know, in many ways it's a visual, allegorical, stylized kind of uh, I wouldn't just say depiction. It's a, you know, it's trying to kind of produce a new mythopoeia about what each year month of the calendar should be about. This has precedence again in medieval literature and so on. In the case of Bacon, he's telling us how to paint that in actuality. In April, follow the double white violet and so on, the French honeysuckle. So clearly, this is a, you know, what it also underlines is the scope and the possibility of acquiring these herbs and saplings from across the continent. So this is just exactly as Shantiniketan, as so many people who write memoirs about Shantiniketan and its trees would tell you. Most of these were not initially there. People who traveled abroad brought those saplings over. So this is an afforested place. The idea of ashram too is also an artificial garden, constructed garden. I'm not wearing a watch, so keep an eye out, as I said, for senior colleague. Sharuti. I would like to see her waiting. I have kept another of my colleagues waiting last time. Right. So, yeah, then comes in May and June, you have come pinks of all sorts, so on. Uh, your exotic names, your French marigold, Flos africanus. So, clearly, herbs and shrubs that have an origin in Africa. So, in many ways, this garden is also maybe seen as a product of a global cartography. This is a kind of proto-imperial, fantasy of getting the best from different parts of the globe. And then, so this is also you may see as a natural museum. This is the same museological impulse. Just as British Museum was kind of bringing together best artifacts from ancient cultures, ancient spaces, ancient countries, nations from across the world. Garden is also that same imperial impulse, a natural garden where the best trees from all across the world with good growth. July, then follows July. For each of these, I'm not going into the details. It's quite superfluous to do so, because the significance, the importance of the individual flowers is already given in the notes. I am giving you my reading. Then comes September, in October. So flowers. So what is he telling us? Interestingly, aesthetics is also a science. There's a science to it. Right, aesthetics, even as he talks about natural pleasure, nature too has to be understood, known. And this knowing is the science. Knowing is not about knowing in terms of the allegorical significance. It's about going behind the allegorical significance, behind the given name, and finding out the science of its biological patterns, its lifetime. The kind of things that we today, if you were to open a Wikipedia page on carnations, then you get the whole you know, spectrum of information, scientific name, how it grows, where it grows. Let us understand that this is all accumulated knowledge. This is the kind of things that naturalists slowly, over years and centuries, have built up. This has happened through the processes of science, which we associate with empiricism, empirical science. Empirical is when you go, let's say, whatever that might be, you go and investigate it directly. Yes, and also experiment on as a follow up from that. First, you go find out, and then you want to know what it is not. That is where the experimentation comes. So then comes October.
Ordinary.
Experimental
And experiential. Same.
Now, pull out. Experience. When it is controlled experience, then it is experiment. When you intentionally do something to find out what the experience will be like, then it becomes, then there's an overlap of experience or the experiential and the experimental. Okay, there's an intentionality to it. But if it is experiential, you're letting the experience work on you, speak to you, and you're tracking that. Instead of, rather than trying to control it. You're recording it, but not controlling it. The whole point about experiment is that there's a certain kind of interaction. So on that note, I will resume. I have a class tomorrow. But I won't be able to take it. I'll be invigilating. So